Okay, I think that's my signal to start. So I'd like to welcome everyone to our online symposium From Slavery to Colonisation, Land and Labour, which we're holding this afternoon or this evening and tomorrow. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge that we're holding this event, or we're hosting it at least, on the traditional country of the Whadjuk Noongar people of southwest and Western Australia, and we pay our respects to their elders past and present. So over the next couple of afternoons, we'll be exploring aspects of recent research into the legacies of British slavery. Our intention is to bring the abolition of slavery in the Caribbean and Britain's tropical colonies into conversation with what has been called the settler revolution. So generally these two historical processes or frameworks have been considered separately, and we seek to draw them into conversation. We want to see emancipation from 1833 as a transitional moment rather than a kind of turning point or landmark, a fixed moment. And we're looking for continuities between these imperial systems. We're very privileged to begin proceedings with a keynote from a distinguished speaker, Jane Carey. Jane teaches and researches in history at the University of Wollongong. I've known and respected and admired Jane for many years. And one thing I will say is that she's characterised, I think, by a tremendous openness to new ideas and new concepts and applying them to history and to particular problems that happened. So I think I've been very privileged to witness this over a number of years now. Her work spans settler colonial, women's and Indigenous histories with a focus on reproduction, biopolitics and cultures of science and colonialism. She is the co-editor of a number of landmark book collections, Reorienting Whiteness, Creating White Australia, Indigenous Networks and Colonial Formations. And her forthcoming monograph, I understand that it will be out early next year, but she's been madly proofing lately, is called Taking to the Field, A History of Australian Women in Science. So with no further ado, I'd like to welcome our keynote, Dr. Jane Carey. Welcome.
Thanks, Jane. I'll just share my screen. Yes, thank you. I would also like to begin by acknowledging the Bunurong and Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, whose lands I'm speaking to from today, and whose sovereignty has never been ceded. And in the context of this event, I'd like to particularly reflect on the ongoing violence and injustices that settler colonialism continues to inflict on First Nations peoples in this country. I'd also like to thank Jane for her very kind introduction there, and for the invitation to speak. Also to Zoe and to Denise for all her organising work in putting this event together. So, my paper today sets out to explore the too often overlooked role of women and reproduction, and I'm talking reproduction in the biological sense, in settler colonialism. My specific interest is on how and when white women's reproductive capacities became recognised as vital to successful settler colonisation. I'm talking here both within the historical record and in historical scholarship. And of course, one key figure in this constellation is Edward Gibbon Wakefield, who's going to feature quite a lot in the discussions at this event. So in his 1849 book, A View of the Art of Colonisation, Wakefield observed, in colonisation, women have a part so important that all depends on their participation in the work. If only a few emigrate in proportion to men, the colonisation is slow and unsatisfactory. An equal emigration of the sexes is one essential condition of the best colonisation. So I'm going to be talking more about this, but one essential feature of the scheme of systematic colonisation that he first articulated in 1829 was the way that married couples were seen as essential parts of the scheme. And as I'll go on to discuss, Wakefield's focus on women was related to both their perceived civilising influence and their reproductive capacities, the latter of which he saw as having decided economic benefits for the colonies. And not least because, in producing children, women added to the future labour force at a time when colonial labourers were desperately needed. And in this way, as I hope to show, reproduction was fundamentally connected to colonial labour, particularly during the period of the transition away from slavery and of convict transportation, as well as more broadly, the settlers' capacity to maintain their occupation of the land they had stolen. So there's been a recent flowering of research on Wakefield, and many of the people involved in this flowering are speaking at this event. But what I want to focus on here is the way that the reproductive kind of elements of Wakefield's scheme have not yet attracted much attention. So in this paper, I will thus spend quite some time elucidating quite specifically how women and reproduction featured in Wakefield's scheme. And I'll also be situating this discussion within quite a long time frame, stretching from the earliest phases of the planning for the New South Wales colony in the 1780s, right up to the 1920s. And examining how political economists and colonial administrators in Britain and Australia approached and enumerated questions of reproduction and population. And I'll do this by focusing on some key moments and some key writers. And unusually for an historian, I'll also be going in reverse chronological order in this paper, starting in the early 1900s, moving back to discuss Wakefield's writings of the 1830s and 1840s, and then finishing in the New South Wales colony in the early 1800s, before very quickly circling back to where I started. Okay. So as I said, there's been this flowering of scholarship on Wakefield and systematic colonisation in both historical and literary studies. I started to write a list and then it was getting too long, so I just stopped here. So, but just to say that it's both historical work and also the last two works listed here in literary studies. So there's been a renewed resurgence of interest in Wakefield, something of a rediscovery of his importance, as Angela Woolcott has put it, as one of the most important advocates of and theorists of settler colonialism during its 19th century ascendancy. So I'll leave it to the others who are going to speak to elaborate their particular contributions to this burgeoning field. But as this, the outline for this symposium indicates, so the ways Wakefield helps us understand in a number of ways how abolition produced settler colonialism. And it also requires settler colonies to look to new sources of labour to meet their requirements, to enable the successful exploitation of the land and its resources. And as I hope to show, this is where issues of women's reproductive powers at certain points in time became critical. So this scholarship on Wakefield is part of a broader return to political economy in colonial histories after decades of the cultural turn. And there are many exciting new directions in this work. But I am kind of worried that there's also a risk of losing some of the enormous gains of the cultural turn, particularly in terms of its foregrounding of questions of women and gender. Settler colonialism more broadly is still typically understood as a project of invasion by migration, a project overwhelmingly undertaken by men. The movement of people from the home country to the settler colony is its defining feature. And the critical forces of women, reproduction and biopolitics in settler colonial history remain underexplored. And this is despite decades of exceptional scholarship on women, gender and empire. Despite the scholarship, these vital topics are still routinely omitted from mainstream histories of settler colonialism more broadly. So, for example, we can think of James Bellach's influential economic study of the settler revolution, which Jane has already referred to. So, for example, that study has really no place for women or for Indigenous people, for that matter. So I'm thinking here of the work of scholars like Adele Perry, and as well as many others who again are speaking at this event. And particularly her observation that colonies of settlement are distinguished from other kinds of colonies, chiefly by their reproductive and gendered character. The colonizers settle implies more than residence. It denotes a reproductive regime depended on the presence of settler women who literally reproduce the colony. So I'm also building here on some of my own prior work, and this includes a piece I wrote with Penny Edmonds, which focused particularly on this, what we call a failed encounter between the kind of established canon, if you like, of settler colonial history and the cutting edge work of predominantly feminist scholars of empire and colonialism, which centralised issues of reproduction and gender. So a key point I'm hoping to establish here is that immigration alone was not sufficient to secure the future of white settler colonies. Settler colonisation required that the colony and later nations could reproduce itself, quite literally reproduce itself. To put it another way, settler colonialism needs to be understood far more through the lens of reproduction, both local and metropolitan. So another touch point for these kinds of reflections is 1988 article, but still classic and highly pertinent, on imperialism and motherhood. So she observed in this article that in early 20th century Britain, the birth rate became a matter of national and imperial importance. Population was power. And this idea of population as power translated into voluminous discussions of populations as key foundations for British global dominance. And these discussions in turn overwhelmingly focused on the former settler colonies in ways that demonstrated the centrality of white reproduction and the broader politics of population to settler colonialism. So these discussions focused on the power particularly of the white populations. So we're not talking about the empire as a whole, we're talking particularly about its white populations. And the argument was that if British population did not increase fast enough to fill the empty spaces of the empire, others would. So this idea of population power was taken up in all sorts of different ways and graphically illustrated, for example, in these sorts of historical atlases and maps. So here we see the populations of the white population of the British Empire, and the relative sizes of the countries, they're drawn in proportion to their populations. So this is kind of a graphic illustration of population power. This is the same basic graphic updated 10 years later with new population figures. You also see things like this in the Atlas of the World. Each countries have one circle indicating their population and another indicating their area. So these kinds of graphic representations were one way in which this population power was expressed. So in contrast to 19th century Malthusian fears of overpopulation, the major demographic threat in this period was actually seen to be the declining white birth rates in both the metropole and the colonies. And this phenomenon itself actually flew directly in the face of Malthus's theories. So numerous publications proliferate on the decline of the birth rate in this period. There's just a couple of examples there. And many of these focus more specifically on the implications of this declining birth rate for the empire. So, speaking in 1914 to the Royal Colonial Institute in London on this topic, Charles Drysdale, then president of the Malthusian League, addressed his audience in the following terms. In the whole range of the social and imperial questions, not one is of greater interest and importance than that of the quality and quantity of the inhabitants of the different parts of our empire, and the effect of a declining birth rate upon the efficiency of the individual and the race. He went on to argue that the security and prosperity of our empire would be best secured by having a maximum number of healthy, virile, efficient and patriotic inhabitants in every portion of it. Drysdale wasn't alone in this kinds of interests and making and the concern about the declining birth rate. It's another publication 3 years later by James Marchant, who was then secretary of the British National Birth Rate Commission, and also of the Council for the Promotion of Race Regeneration, amongst many other activities. So he wrote this, this is a 250-page book on this topic of birth rates and empire. And as the preface explained, the book was concerned with the serious consequences for the future of the empire and the race, which would result from a decline in the birth rate. From the first chapter, though, so this book very much focused on the settler colonies. So India and Africa are briefly mentioned, but its main concern was with the white people of the settler colonies. And the fact that these are actually no longer formally part of the empire is an issue that's acknowledged and then swiftly forgotten. He conceptualised the empire as a growing federation of practically independent and yet, as they now realise, intimately interdependent nations, described as our dominions beyond the sea. And we recall that the nature and number of their varied populations hitherto, so far as white people are concerned, are almost entirely supplied from the motherland. So this is talking about, the empire as a whole. Then he argued a much larger white population, and this imperative was being threatened by their and Britain's declining birth rate. So he talks about how in the whole British Empire there are about a white population of about 60 million, but only 15 million of these remain to distribute over, govern, develop and defend our mighty daughter nations of Canada, Australia and New Zealand, and immense vacant spaces in Africa and other lands. So these are some of the kinds of figures and tables included in this. I'm not sure if the graphic's particularly clear, but this is the birth rate on the top of these, this is the death rate, and this is infant mortality in those kind of graphs distributed there. So just looking at these, this all seems very nice and neat, but collating this kind of information took an enormous amount of work. So the fact that such effort was put into pulling these numbers together indicates that they were seen as very important. So the chapter 6 in this book examined the issue of migration. And this again highlighted the sparse population of our colonies, which we hold but have failed to people. And as discussion in this chapter again made clear, the concern was around, almost entirely around the settler colonies, which were described as nearly empty, and the fact that they desperately needed more women to increase their population. Okay, so there's numerous other books produced on this topic, one in 1920 called The Problems of Population and Parenthood, which was produced by another publication, the National Birth Rate Commission, concluded that the contemporary movements of population in the Dominion and the proportional distribution of sexes throughout the empire were critical questions that needed to be addressed. And the dangers of the empty space of the empire might become the object of Japanese imperial design or other rival empires. And it particularly appealed to the women citizens to assist in this imperial cause. It argued that it is for the women of the empire to save the empire by securing its continuance for the fulfilment of its beneficent mission in the world. So those are the kinds of metropolitan discussions going on around this issue. The view from the colonies was somewhat different. If the metropolitan discussions focused on the need for more reproduction to supply the empire with much needed immigrants, the view from the colony of New South Wales, as I said, was a bit different. And here, critical attention to the problem of declining birth rates was spearheaded by the New South Wales government statistician, T.A. Coghlan. So Coghlan was actually an engineer, kind of reinvents himself as a statistician when he's appointed to this position in 1886. So Coghlan writes the first major treatise on the declining birth rate in Australia in 1903. And he begins by observing that Australia, with its large and sparsely populated territory and with its industries and process of rapid development, might reasonably be pictured as an ideal land wherein the people might prove fruitful and multiply. Present indications, however, give no hope of attaining population springing from Australasian parents. He particularly contrasted the new nation of Australia with the old metropolitan civilisation. arguing that there's nothing incongruent in the declining birth rate in an old civilization, but to new countries where population is so much desired, it is novel and astonishing and claims the deepest attention. Significantly, Coghlan claimed that immigration could no longer be relied on to supply the Australian nation's the population needs, because immigration had practically ceased and the maintenance and increase of population depended upon the birth rate alone. And so this is the shift from seeing settler colonisation, if you like, as simply a migratory progress and focusing instead on its internal reproduction. So this is a influential treatise. It resulted in the founding of a Royal Commission into the decline of the birth rate in New South Wales. And this was the first such commission ever constituted on this topic anywhere in the world. And it largely sort of conformed to Coughlan's dire warnings about the consequences that might result from this declining birth rate, particularly for the continuance of the race in New South Wales if the native-born population did not reproduce itself more rapidly. It was emphasised that this could have severe consequences for the possibility of maintaining a white Australia, and it depended on, whether or not we shall be able to people the vast areas of the continent. So there's it's a lengthy report, wax lyrical on these themes. And so the threatening its continuance, this is seen as a dire threat. So these discussions of declining birth rates positioned white women's reproductive capacities as imperative to both the empire and Australian settler colonial and the Australian settler colonial nation. Wakefield did much the same. So a number of scholars have previously noted the place of women in Wakefield's schemes, but only in relation to how they would raise the moral, social standards of the colony. But as I will now discuss, women's role as reproducers of labour was actually the more significant plank of Wakefield's arguments on the need for equal numbers of the sexes to be involved in his plans for systematic colonisation. And this is evident from his very first anonymously published writings, a letter from Sydney in 1829. So this is a work that purported to be an authentic letter from a colonist resident in the colony of Sydney. So significantly, the first context in which in this work Wakefield addresses the question of reproduction is in the section dealing with the extension of Britain. Responding to Malthus's principle of population, he notes that there would of course be a limit to colonial population expansion. But Wakefield's fictional Sydney colonists argued that this would not occur for quite some time. And in any case, by this time we might, quote, discover a way to new countries in the moon, or what appears as quite difficult, a means of checking population otherwise than by sin and sorrow. Wakefield then presents very specific arguments on the desirability of limiting immigration to the colonies to young persons, and particularly young couples of both sexes. So to send young couples of this kind to the colonies would have a dual impact. It would reduce the British overpopulation problem, both by removing the people themselves, but also the children that the women then produce. But those children would become very valuable in the colonies. So as Wakefield put it, to check this too rapid increase of people in Britain, it would be advisable to select as immigrants young persons only, and especially young couples of both sexes. The domestic power of increase would thereby be greatly weakened, and the colonial power of increase would be strengthened by the same degree. The other kinds of so he goes on to outline numerous other reasons in support of this, particularly that would prevent, quote, the evils which here, especially men in New South Wales, have attended to arisen from the disproportion of the sexes. In other words, they would make the best members of a new society. would also result in another benefit, namely that the colonies would no longer be new societies, strictly speaking. They would be, quote, so many extensions of an old society. So here, women and their reproductive capacities are linked to what's seen as one of the key benefits, one of the many key benefits of systematic colonisation, that it would reproduce the same kind of society in the colonies as that in Britain itself. Thus, quote, every grant of land in these colonies would be an extension, though distant, of Britain itself, and would provide so much more room for all classes of Britons. So this work concludes with an outline of a system of colonisation with 9 articles. And 2 of these explicitly reference the need for equal numbers of both sexes and for young persons in this. So here are your 9 articles. Here are the 2 that mention the need to have equal numbers of both sexes. And Article 6 particularly had a long note which started to expand upon what he saw as the economic benefits of approaching colonisation in this way. So first, he pointed to how the colonies would reap the benefits of the reproductive potential of such a group of colonists in terms of increasing the colonial population, compared with the slow growth that would occur if only men were sent, or colonists of older ages. Quote, any number of immigrants, in short, would, if selected as proposed, treble themselves in the first 20 years, whereas a number of immigrants of all ages might not, and probably would not begin to increase until the end of 20 years. Second, increasing the local reproduction of population, which in this context should be read as equating to increasing the future labour force, would be far cheaper than the cost of transporting immigrants from Britain. And his calculations here even took into account compound interest. If anyone knows actually how you work that out, do let me know. I'm not actually on top of that completely. So given the centrality of reproduction to Wakefield's schemes as summarised in these 9 short articles, it does seem somewhat strange that this element has not attracted more attention. And particularly since he expanded far more fully on these themes in his next major work, England and America. Again, this was published anonymously. So chapters in, this is an enormously long book, 2 volumes, and yes, many topics covered. So chapters in both volumes discuss the large numbers of single women in England who had, quote, not the least prospect of happiness in marriage. They had no marriage prospects and were doomed to become either prostitutes or governesses, depending on their class. So he waxes lyrical about how such women would be much better off in America, where they were desperately wanted, where they could marry well. Wakefield claimed that settlers offered to the captains of English ships £250 of prime tobacco for each young woman of pure health and good temper, whom the latter could bring from England, harmless and bearing a certificate of honest manners from the clergyman of her parish. So the last chapter in this book, in the second volume of the book, was titled The Art of Colonisation, which was actually the title of his later 1849 book. And in this, the need for women was dealt with in great detail and the economic benefits fully spelled out. Wakefield observed that, quote, if the object were to procure at the least cost the greatest amount of labour for immediate employment, it would appear at first sight that immigrants brought to the colonies ought to be all of them males in the prime of life. But he immediately turns around and follows this with an explanation that it is only at first sight that this can appear. In explaining this further, he first points to the domestic offices that women usually perform for men: cooking, mending clothes, making beds. Having women perform these duties allowed men to fully focus, quote, the whole of his time, attention and labour to the work of production. He concluded then that, quote, economically speaking, it seems quite plain the poor immigrants brought to a colony by the purchase money of wastelands ought to be men and women in equal numbers, and if married, so much the better. So there's long discussions, further discussions about these economic benefits, particularly the emphasis on young couples and young people whose powers of labour would last longer. It's all about extracting the greatest value out of the cost of transporting these immigrants to the colony. So this is why old people and children should not be included. Children in particular would encumber someone, and they would not, quote, for some time be of any use as labourers. So the maximum value could be obtained by bringing none but grown-up young persons. These colonists would also be just at the natural time of marriage and expanded at some length, again here on these pages, so why that would make them exactly the right kind of colonists that were needed. The added benefit, of course, was that these young married couples would have children who would increase the colonial population and supply the next generation of labourers. And we used the example of Virginia to demonstrate how a colonial population could actually rapidly decrease if there were only a small proportion of women. So he claimed that, 20 years after the foundation of Virginia, the number of colonists was only about 1,800, though during the 20 years previously, nearly 20,000 persons had emigrated there. And he devoted some time to kind of trying to calculate, calculating what the population of New South Wales would have been if they had followed his suggested scheme from their initial founding, arguing that they would have a population of nearly 500,000 instead of what was the actual population then of only just under 50,000. So he argued, quote, the progress of population, and we may add of colonisation, would have been 10 times as great as it has been, with the same outlay for bringing people to the colony. That's the young married couples. He further claimed that, quote, if all the people who had removed from Europe to America had been young couples, just arrived at the age of puberty, slavery in North America must long since have died a natural death. There wouldn't have been a need for slave labour because there would have been enough labour being produced by reproduction. Okay, so I think the analogy also here that he makes is to the very, so he contrasts the lack of human population in New South Wales with the superabundance of sheep. And he talks very specifically about how the reproduction of sheep has been very carefully managed so that there are now, the colony is now swarming with sheep. And this is, in fact, yes, something that comes out very clearly in the early historical records. There's lots and lots of detailed enumeration of the livestock, and particularly the numbers of males and females, and there's specific regulations around not killing breeding stock, not killing the female sheep, for instance, and so on and so forth. So I'll come back to some of these early colonial records in a minute. But yeah, just to return that quickly, just for to Wakefield just for one more moment. So certainly Wakefield also did talk quite a bit about the civilising and moral influence that women would exert in the colonies, and that, quote, all the evils which are seldom sprung from a disproportion between the sexes would be avoided, and that this is the kind of aspect that has been most focused on. But the main focus is on the population and the children that would be produced. And here on these pages, he talks about the colony becoming a great nursery. And all of these, without being scattered, would offer the finest opportunity that ever occurred to see what might be done for society by universal education. So he concludes that it is clear, to whatever extent the system was pursued, the colonies would be more extensive under this system, that they would be extended as rapidly as possible, and that every new colony or an increase of the old one would be an extension of an old society to a new place. Oh, sorry. Okay, so this brings us to his 1849 book on the art of colonisation, which I'm not going to talk about much because this simply recapitulates many of most of the arguments I've already just gone through in his earlier works. But I will just, yes, it does, again, just to give you a taste of the many, many topics covered, and just also to kind of return to the quote that I opened with. And to give it a bit more of a context, he notes that in trade, navigation, war and politics, in all business of a public nature, except works of benevolence and colonisation, the stronger sex alone takes an active part. But in colonisation, women have a part so important that all depends on their participation. So he really is making very specific arguments about women's role in colonisation and how that differs from all kind of other areas of public life and activity. Okay, so yes, sorry, just to that repeats some of the things, the ways in which the sale of extracting the greatest value from the sale of the wastelands by selecting young people of marriageable age. This is expounded on and expounded on, expounded on and expounded on. So Wakefield's observations about the value of women and their reproductive potential to the new colonies sort of seem so obvious that it's hard to believe that they weren't picked up earlier by some people. And certainly they were actually picked up by some people earlier. I mean, I think it was Bentham who argued that the New South Wales colony was doomed to failure because of the low proportion of women that had been sent there. But what I'm interested in is to go back to some of the early colonial records and see if there's any sense of this kind of what becomes a later, very dominant kind of way of thinking about women and their place in settler colonisation. So I've gone back to these early records to see if there's any traces of that, but also simply just to identify how women and reproduction were positioned in discussions and enumerations of the colonial population in these records. And these are, of course, probably some of the most well-worn historical records of Australia that they've been gone over by so many colleagues, so many historians in so many different ways. And many Australian historians have, of course, looked back to these statistical records, particularly for what they can tell us about the composition of the Australian population, to reconstruct information on the ordinary convicts and settler lives. These are very detailed records. And a great many people have approached them then from the perspective of historical demography. So I'm thinking here about Janet McCallum and Hamish Maxwell Stewart and so on. So the first actual mention of women in these early colonial records is in the very first kind of planning phases, the heads of a plan in 1786. And here it's conceived, it's acknowledged right from the very earliest planning stages that the lack of women is going to be a problem for the colony and that something needs to be done about it. The solution that's proposed is that the colonists should procure women from the islands. Friendly Islands, New Caledonia, many other places are suggested, from whence any number may be procured without difficulty. So it's seen as a problem that really needs to be addressed, because without a sufficient proportion of that sex, it is well known that it would be impossible to preserve the settlement from gross irregularities and disorders. So this idea is taken up by Governor Phillip, who becomes the first governor. You see it here in his, this quite lengthy document where he writes down his views on how the conduct of the expedition the establishment of the colony should be undertaken. So you see here that he's got the plan to procure women from the islands features here. Now, this page actually contains also one of his most famous statements about the fact that there should be no slavery in a free land and no slaves in the new planned colony. This list also, though, has mundane things like how the colonies, how the convicts are going to be clothed in the colonies, and then also into land grants and these multiple questions that Phillip is trying to consider in how the colony will be established. So this also makes it into the first instructions that are given to Phillip. Again, the procurement of women, but they're to be taken a special care that officers do not take any compulsive measures to acquire these women. And Philip also talks about marriage being encouraged amongst the convicts, and also envisages that the natives, it is probable, permit their women to marry and live with the men after a certain time. So these are kinds of the ways in which he's thinking about how women will fit into the new colonies. Now, the idea of procuring women from the islands actually is dropped almost immediately. This is his first dispatch from Sydney, and on the one hand, he's saying that he's not going to pursue the idea of sending for women from the islands to just pine away in misery. But he does say that more women are required, and he asks them to send more women from Britain. And this is the last time that a request like that will be made for quite some time. So, in fact, women in these records are seen as a burden from this point on, from the early stages of the colony. So the overriding concern of the Crown, of course, in relation to the colony, was that the cost of the colony should be kept to an absolute minimum, and that it should progress towards self-sufficiency and ideally profitability as quickly as possible. So reports on the colonial population were profoundly shaped by the need to justify and minutely account for the colony's expenditure, which consisted in a large part of providing rations and other essentials to the convicts and others who were there who couldn't support themselves. So within these kind of schemas, a whole bunch of people get classified as non-productive, and that includes the civilian officers and the military. They're not engaged in productive labour. They are, in a sense, a burden on the colony in the sense of costing money, in the same way as women, invalids and children. So so here we have sort of the accounting that takes place of these costs, how much it costs to keep the colonists alive, and so on and so forth. So I'm running out of time, so I just want to flick through quickly some of the really extensive enumeration that occurs in the colonies. What I'm interested in is the categories that they choose to enumerate, what categories they choose to count. And that there's all sorts of, so this is the numbers of people victualled in the colony. So this is a kind of a standard template they use for quite some time in terms of enumerating the population. So the whole number on full rations, number of victualled, women, children, natives, free women wives of convicts, and free people become settlers. So these are on the path to becoming self-sufficient. And of course, the fact they have to account for the supplies. Do they have enough supplies to feed the population? So these are the kinds of counts that are taking place. There's musters, and at certain points there's real fervour to actually count, to get a really accurate count of the number of inhabitants of the colony. This is to also ascertain the available labour for various essential projects that need to be done. And so on the one hand, you have this accounting of the convicts and others who need to be supported by the government. There's also accounting of the free settlers who start to arrive. So this I find really interesting in that even the women and the children are named, and the ages are recorded. So obviously there's some reason why they're doing this, and this is, again, it gets a little less detailed with future settlers arriving, but they're intensely interested in these settlers, free settlers coming, their family groups, and they're seen as critical to the future of the colony. And there's a lot also about orphans, and an orphanage is created for the female students, convicts. And that, again, that's detailed enumerations here, and particularly talking here about how they're accounting for their the expenditure, and how they're then either married or bound as apprentices, so going into labour there. So this is the first time that there's an actual comparative statement of the increase of the population. Again, with men, women and children being separated, the deaths and so on being accounted for. There are all sorts of these kinds of enumerations. And this is kind of the one I want to finish on here, is this incredibly complex kind of table with all different kinds of enumerations of the settler, of the free settler populations, what their holdings, the number of sheep, goats, and whether they're victualled or not. And this is all all of this information is drawn together into this amalgam in this one table. So just to quickly then conclude. So it's clear that by the time that Wakefield was writing, women were desperately wanted in the Sydney colony. The cumulative effects of convict transportation meant women were outnumbered 4 to 1. And this, in fact, one of the very first kind of practical outcomes of Wakefield's writing was the first assisted immigration scheme set up by the British government in 1831, and these were aimed at single women. So they brought out several boatloads of single women to the colonies, and it was funded by land sales. So and throughout the next decades, women slightly outnumbered men in the migrants who were assisted, not in the total number of migrants, but the assisted migrants who were who came out to the colony. So this continued up to 1900. So by the 1880s, immigration and natural population increase had been effective in greatly reducing the gender imbalance of the colonies. And this was just at the time when the declining white birth rate began to emerge as the major population concern. So circling back, seeing how this then becomes the next population concern about the ways in which immigration alone is not sufficient to secure the future of the white settler nation. To be truly secure, the nation needed to be able to reproduce itself independently of the mother country. And I think I'll just leave it there. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Jane. That was very rich, and I think you covered a lot of ground. It was very striking, I thought, the way you evoked how people were seen as these economic units alongside the sheep and the horses and the other sort of assets. So I have quite a few questions. Before I pose them, however, I just wanted to remind everyone who's joined us that you can put a question or a comment into the chat or the Q&A function. They both seem to be working. So please do that, and I can convey them as the host in the webinar format. But I just had, I have a few questions for you, Jane.
Okay, great.
But I wanted to start actually with a couple of comments, which your discussion of the sort of debates and sort of theories about the role of women in reproduction in settler colonialism, very prevalent in the early 20th century, very much embedded in theories such as Wakefield's, but also contrasting those with some of the earlier ways of thinking about these sorts of issues. It strikes me that it would also be quite interesting to relate those to similar debates about reproduction that were conducted earlier in the context of slavery and Britain's sort of slave system in its sugar colonies and in the West Indies, the Caribbean, but also in the southern states, the slave states of America, and those kind of concerns about, population, maintaining a declining population. But on the other hand, they also evoke some of those debates about the transportation movement that culminated in the 1840s in places like New South Wales, and also, they shared elements of those concerns about, you know, the lack of women and the kinds of proclivities and vices that they would lead to. But anyway, so that's a comment. So I'm going to come back now and ask my question. So the first one is, this is really such a kind of missing piece of the jigsaw. And I'm wondering why you think these, you know, the reproductive aspects of Wakefield's scheme and other theories of settler colonisation have been neglected. Why do you think that might be?
Well, look, I think there's a couple of reasons. One is that that reproduction is just seen as a natural thing. It's not seen as a topic of political economy. It's seen as, well, it just, you know, it's part of nature. It just happens. It's not something that was, not something that people recognise as something that was actually, that the state was actually attempting to intervene in, or was an interest of for colonial governance or other, other aspects of state formation or imperial formation. And so I think that that's part of it. The other, of course, is that, so for the earlier period, so the ideas about Malthus and the principle of population was that Britain didn't have to worry about not having enough people. They had the opposite problem. And that Malthus's principle was that they would always have more than enough people because they had enough, the population outran the resources. So there was always going to be more people that exceeded the limit of the capacity to feed them, and so on and so forth. So it's not seen as an issue like that in the colonial administrators. I think it might have emerged in the colony itself, except for the fact that they were just so minutely, so overdetermined by the need to justify the expenses of the colony, and that in that kind of framework, women and children are seen as a burden, not a bonus, not a benefit to the colony in any sort of way. So I want to look deeper into this. There's some stuff around families and so on that, you know, suggests maybe there's some other stuff going on. But yeah, there's many other kinds of reasons. I mean, I think a lot of this writing is done by men who are interested in different kinds of themes. That's great. There's some great stuff out there. But, you know, it is really been, you know, the feminist scholars of empire who have taken these kinds of ideas up. Yeah.
And I wonder also, I mean, one of the kind of interesting things about Wakefield and this settler revolution is the commoditisation of land and labour, you know, putting a pound sign on it. And I wonder whether, I'm thinking that Adam Smith actually was criticised by Priscilla Wakefield, Edward Gibbon Wakefield's grandmother, because he had, in Wealth of Nations, in his kind of theory of economy and politics, he'd omitted the value of women's labour. So she actually pointed out much earlier that, you know, women were invisible. And then, of course, Wakefield came along, you know, 2 generations later and said that Adam Smith had also left out slave labour, had, you know, as a kind of factor in his economic theory. So, yeah, really, really interesting to think about those different reasons why it's fallen out, but also what difference it makes, as is shown when we bring them back in. There is a comment in the Q&A. So a couple of people have actually provided references to their work, which also touches on this. So thank you very much. Can you see them, Jane?
Yes, I can, and I have been meaning to. Yes, I have not been able to get that book yet, and I will. Yes.
So thank you. And just can't see that in question and answer, Melanie Burkett has written a chapter in her book Opposing Australia's First Assistant Immigrants, 1832 to 1842. And also, I just want to note, Raewyn Dalziel has also commented that her 1997 essay, Men, Women and Wakefield, in Edward Gibbon Wakefield and the Colonial Dream, a reconsideration. So thank you both. I think it just speaks to the quality of our audience today, as well as our presenters. There are also, I do see that we can unmute people if someone has a question. So, Matthew, do you have a question or a comment there? No, that's okay. I'm just going to quickly move on then to my second question. So, just wondering how this approach and this kind of emphasis and the attention that we're paying to women and reproduction might shift our understanding of the relationship between land, labour and colonisation. If you have any thoughts on that, Jane.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to what you were actually talking about earlier is the analogy, the similarities with slavery and the reproduction of slave labour, and the women's, you know, kind of central role in that, and the kind of burgeoning field of scholarship around that. So yeah, I guess again, it's only when there's, you know, in the context of the colonies where there's a critical labour shortage that it becomes really apparent the women's role in actually reproducing the labour force that is required. So so yeah, absolutely, that's kind of critical. But yeah, again, the land labour equation assumes that there's the labour supply is there. It doesn't need to, you don't need to think about where it might come from. It's going to be there. Malthus has said it's going to be there. You don't have to worry about it. That's, yeah, these kinds of things. What is more, so one of the reasons why I started at the end of the story, if you like, was because that's when, so the British ideas about the declining birth rate and what that means for their capacity to maintain their empire, that is a real shock to them, and it's, you know, directly contradicts Malthus's theory. So that, you know, Malthus didn't take into account women's agency and how many children they might have, for instance, or other kinds of factors. So it really comes as a shock to, it's not just happening in Britain, it's happening across a lot of the West at this time. And so there's all these demographers and statisticians trying to work out what's going on and why it's happening. And yeah, it's just this, they're looking for a new law of population because Malthus is wrong. Yeah.
Great, thank you. What about though, so as we know, in the very first iterations of Wakefield's theory, he's factoring in non-white labour. So Angela Woolcott actually has written about this, and you know, I too find this very interesting because, of course, this is, I think, a kind of connection between the racialised labour regimes that include slavery and enslavement in the Caribbean, and his subsequent, you know, settler colonisation. And of course, from the 1830s, you know, it was officially, the policy was that the Australasian colonies would be white. So yeah, what do you think about the racialised elements of and his, you know, for example, his suggestion of importing Chinese labour into places? Yeah. Like
yeah. So the thing that's so there's not, so yeah, Wakefield's not unusual in suggesting this. There's lots of discussion in the early colonial records about perhaps having Anglo-Indians and other indentured labour, all sorts of ideas about where they might get labour from. What's different about Wakefield's discussion of the Chinese is that he envisages that they will become settlers, that they will marry, that they will take up land, that they'll become a permanent part of, he doesn't talk about intermarriage at all, it's not mentioned. I don't know if he's envisaging that necessarily, but that,
I don't think so.
So other kinds of indentured labour is not, they don't carry those things with them because it's assumed that they're going to be men, that they will probably be indentured temporarily, they won't become a permanent feature. And yeah, so it's really quite a different, and I haven't come to any sort of resolution around this, but Angela might be able to speak more to this, but that it does seem to contradict all of his other statements about how the Sydney, New South Wales will become a new Britain, essentially. He doesn't use those terms, but that's essentially what he's saying, is that it's going to reproduce the British society in Sydney. Yeah.
I think he modifies his ideas in response to official, you know, pushback and events. But anyway, so sorry, just we are running out of time, in fact, so I think we might not, we have a couple more suggestions even. Judith McVeigh, it's no coincidence that anti-abortion laws are introduced in Britain in 1861 and each colony in Australia soon after. The state has always played a large role in women's lives. It's the needs of the capitalist system which requires suitable exploitable labour that are key from my research struggles in the 1970s. So thank you. Heidi Ing says, wonderful presentation. Thank you. Have you explored the Exeter Hall public meeting for references to the emigration of young couples to South Australia? She's noted a quote related to women as the breeders of future generations of labourers. And finally, Deborah Oxley has said, you might be interested in Katrina Alford's book, Production or Reproduction, an economic history of women in Australia. So
thank you for all of those, but I think that just emphasises the point that I kind of made at the start, was that there's a separation between all of these studies and what the mainstream histories of colonisation, colonialism, empire look at, and hopefully we can get an integration happening. That'd be great.
Absolutely. Okay, well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. So I'm sure everyone's madly clapping behind their muted cameras, but thank you so much, Jane. That was really fantastic. We're now going to hand over to Zoe as chair. So I think that already you've been given that capacity. So we'll now move to our next session. And over to you, Zoe.
Great, I think I'm unmuted now. Hello everybody, and seamlessly welcome to the second session of From Slavery to Colonisation. It's a great pleasure to be here today. As Jane has said, my name's Zoe Laidlaw and I'm hosting this session from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation. So I'm over in Melbourne. I'd like to acknowledge them and their elders past and present. So in this next session, this next hour, we're going to have two papers from Jane and Matthew. First, Jane is going to speak. She's giving a paper of about 20 minutes or precisely 20 minutes. And then I will introduce Matthew and he'll follow straight on and give his paper of 20 minutes so that you can put your questions and points of discussion into the Q&A or into the chat, and we'll take all of those and try and generate something of a discussion in the final 20 minutes of this next hour. And you can, of course, put those questions into the chat at any point so you don't forget them. So with no further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce my colleague and our first speaker in this session, Professor Jane Lydon, the Wesfarmers Chair in Australian History in the School of Humanities at UWA. Jane's research centres upon Australia's colonial past and its legacies in the present, and I'm sure that many of you are familiar with her work on popular and especially visual cultures. Jane is particularly concerned with the history of Australia's engagement with anti-slavery, humanitarianism, and ultimately human rights. And with colleagues on the Western Australian Legacies of British Slavery project, she's currently exploring the Australian legacies of British anti-slavery movement by tracing the movement of people, capital and culture from the Caribbean to the settler colonial world. She has another project which is addressing the ways that Australian citizenship has been defined and contested through visual culture. Jane's paper today has the title Linking Slavery and Settler Colonialism, Systematic Colonisation as a Solution to Emancipation. So over to you, Jane.
Thanks so much, Zoe. And I really feel delighted to be here with such a fantastic lineup of fellow speakers. Before I start, I'd just like to, I'm going to share my screen. And if there's any problem with that, please, great, thanks for that. So again, I've already done this, but for those who have joined us since we began, I just want to acknowledge again that I'm speaking from the traditional country of the Whadjuk Noongar people down here in the southwest, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I think, and again, just to reiterate, this is our our website, but this is just part of a larger collaborative team effort exploring the legacies of British slavery. And finally, before I start, I just want to note that I think it's very lucky that we've heard from Jane Carey, who's emphasised the role of women and gender and reproduction, because I realise that my own PowerPoint features nothing but old aristocratic white men. So please brace yourselves for that. So, okay. On Tuesday, the 14th of May in 1833, the new Secretary of the Colonial Office, Edward Smith Stanley, rose in the British House of Commons to present the government's long-awaited proposal for the abolition of slavery. The chamber was full and there was no room on the benches, much like this moment depicted here in George Hayter's famous painting, the first Reform Parliament, just a few months earlier. He introduced what he called this question of unparalleled importance, involving a greater amount of property, affecting the happiness and the well-being of a larger portion of individuals than was ever before brought forward. And here he is, Stanley. But this was also a mighty experiment, in Stanley's famous phrase. All sides of the debate agreed on the need for freed slaves to continue to work, but they were not sure how to make this happen. An apprenticeship program was proposed as an intermediate stage between slave labour and wage labour, not just to ensure continuing productivity, but as a means of becoming civilised. As you can see here in Stanley's comment, he's saying, you know, it would be a problem to throw the slaves suddenly into freedom. They'd be tempted to recur to their primitive habits of savage life. So these ideas of cultural incapacity were embedded in these debates. Abolition followed decades of debate about the meaning of freedom and labour, both at home within Britain's industrialising landscape, as well as in its Caribbean sugar colonies. At a time when social unrest threatened the stability of the British social order, abolition formed part of a suite of reforms intended in part to maintain elite authority. So, you know, a number of the kind of reforms and concessions made around this time were widely perceived as a kind of the least they could do to prevent revolution, as had happened in other places. A tenet of the abolitionist cause was the superiority of free labour. Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations had first popularised this notion, and the view that there were two methods of motivating the worker, summarised as wages or the whip. Anti-slavery campaigners argued for the relationship between free labour, higher productivity, and colonial prosperity. They believed that free labour would expand markets by allowing the worker to become a consumer, while wage labour would motivate productivity. However, many questioned Smith's axiom. Theories of labour discipline were central within both reforming slavery, so slavery that many worked to ameliorate or make more humane, on the one hand, and the new colonial labour regimes on the other, becoming ever more pressing during the 1820s. Abolitionists such as Thomas Fowell Buxton sought to develop new mechanisms of work discipline that would apply equally to British factories and indeed his own brewery, to Caribbean plantations and to the new settler colonies. In giving evidence to the 1832 House of Lords inquiry into slavery, Buxton had asserted that it may be extremely necessary for the state to introduce laws for protecting persons from living in idleness to the detriment of the state. And indeed, we see echoes of this kind of rhetoric right into the present day. You know, recently Andrew Forrest, for example, spoke about Aboriginal workers in the CDEP as having to be protected from living in idleness in just this way. So I think that these sorts of arguments exemplify the parallels between elite abolitionists' responses to slavery and to domestic British labour. Even the colonial officers, James Stephen, author of the 1833 Act, advocated the dread of starving as a replacement for the dread of being flogged. Grounded in a bourgeois and newly industrialising worldview, abolitionist thought was congruent with the developing coercive policies that supported wage labour. So, for example, the tightening provisions for poor relief that was enacted in the same year that slaves became apprentices in 1834. Contemporary critics also pointed out how the campaign against Caribbean slavery worked to divert attention and sympathy from domestic class struggle. From the earliest years of the anti-slavery movement, radicals and the pro-slavery lobby had claimed that enslaved Africans in the Caribbean were better treated than English industrial workers. So very briefly, don't really have time to go into this, but here we see the radical William Cobbett attacking the leader of the anti-slavery movement at the time, William Wilberforce. Cobbett saying, "Never have you done one single act in favour of those labourers, your fellow Britons, but many and many an act have you done against them." So Wilberforce, for example, was an early, he suggested, combination act that prevented peaceful assembly on the part of workers. But he said, listen to me, did you ever hear of a parcel of people assembled at Manchester in 1819? And here, of course, he's talking about Peterloo, which was a peaceful demonstration that the English, the British state responded to by cutting down men, women and children. And this is dramatised. Here we see on the left the anti-slavery logo with the words around the edge of Wedgwood's medallion, "Am I not a man and a brother?" And here we see a satirical cartoon speaking back to this, this radical cartoon after Peterloo, in which a demonstrator is saying, "Am I not a man and a brother?" And the response, "No, you are a poor weaver." So this is a central tension over these years. Okay, so 5 years before Stanley's momentous proposal to the House of Commons, the young Edward Gibbon Wakefield was languishing in Newgate Jail. He was serving some, very insalubrious circumstances. He was serving a 3-year sentence for the abduction of the 15-year-old heiress, Ellen Turner, his hopes of a parliamentary career blighted by this disgrace. In these disagreeable circumstances, he turned his thoughts to colonisation. Wakefield's anonymous sketch of a proposal for colonising Australasia was first printed in June 1829, and then, as we've heard from Jane Carey, reprinted in December as an appendix to a letter from Sydney, the principal town of Australasia. From the start, Wakefield's thinking engaged closely with contemporary debates regarding slavery, colonisation, and their shared reliance upon cheap and disciplined labour. In Sketch, Wakefield attacked Adam Smith's argument that colonies thrive where they take possession of vacant or thinly populated land, pointing out that Smith had overlooked the role of slave labour in making his calculations, as we've noted already this afternoon. Sketch presented the key elements of his scheme, which essentially aimed to restrict land ownership to the wealthy and to force the poor to labour for them. His object lesson was provided by the tobacco growers of Virginia and Maryland, where slave labour provided the settler with wealth, the means for civic engagement, public eminence, and, if his abilities are great, universal fame, in Wakefield's words. Recreating these conditions in the Australian settlements, he predicted, would make labour cheap and docile. His solution was to restrict access to land by selling it at what he termed the sufficient price. Labourers would be prevented from becoming landowners too soon and would instead be forced to work for cheap wages. Wakefield's key innovation, directly refuting Smith's argument for free labour, was his system for concentrating or combining labour. From the start, Wakefield's vision of concentrated labour was modelled upon the plantation, responding to the need to replace what was becoming an unacceptable institution, that is slavery, with a form of labour that would nonetheless retain slavery's efficient discipline. So Wakefield did indeed have his critics at the time. And what I want to do is, because these are quite abstract themes and debates, what I want to do is sort of exemplify these or instantiate these through particular individuals, such as John Crawford, the physician and surgeon for the East India Company, the Orientalist, and who became an expert on South Asian colonisation. So Crawford, for example, pointed out that Wakefield had based his scheme on the organisation of slave colonies, and queried it on those terms. However, Wakefield's ideas circulated at a time that a growing number of young radicals were becoming concerned with the new Anglophone settler colonies. This group came to be called the colonial reformers. Combining land commoditisation with the appropriation of labour, Wakefield extrapolated his argument that slavery formed the basis for colonial prosperity to conclude that systematic colonisation was the only practical means of abolishing slavery. In the momentous debates in Parliament in 1833, Wakefield's principles of systematic colonisation were an important touchstone. For example, Henry George Grey, who at the time was known as Viscount Howick, between 1807 and 1845, when his father, the second Earl Grey, died, when he became the third Earl Grey. At the time of the debate about the Emancipation Act, Howick was the Under-Secretary of State for War and the Colonies after the Whigs came to power in 1830, and his father, the second Earl Grey, became Prime Minister, so a key figure. In this role, Howick shared some of Wakefield's views, overseeing the Ripon Land Regulations of 1831, which brought an end to free grants in the colonies and provided for sales by auction at a minimum price. Like many of his radical colleagues, Howick was a strong supporter of the anti-slavery movement. As an immediatist, he resigned when an apprenticeship period was attached to emancipation. Yet in preparing for the proposed Emancipation Bill, Howick suggested that the great problem to be solved is to devise some mode of inducing the freed slaves to undergo the regular and continuous labour, which is indispensable in carrying on the production of sugar. So he shared in this general concern to maintain productivity and avoid ruin. Like Wakefield, and surely thinking of Swan River, which had been the new colony founded in 1829, he referred to the Australian colonies as an object lesson, where the high price of labour tempted indentured labourers from their master. So he recommended that raising the price of land high enough to prevent freed slaves from buying their own small plots on which to support themselves would maintain the class and labour structure of slavery. Also quoting Wakefield in the emancipation debate, but arguing against immediate abolition, were figures such as Robert Peel and the economist Colonel Robert Torrens, who we see here in this portrait sitting down with his son, Robert Richard Torrens. These figures saw apprenticeship as a means of ensuring the maintenance of the planters' labour supply and supposedly teaching the enslaved how to be free. Wakefield's powerful and vocal supporters succeeded in making systematic colonisation central to subsequent colonial policy. For example, in founding the colony of South Australia. In late 1833, the South Australian Association was formed to proposing a Crown colony, and the South Australian Act was passed in 1834. Again, Torrens was appointed chairman of the Colonisation Commission to manage land sales and immigration in May 1835. The timing of the establishment of this colony links it very closely to abolition and its compensation provisions, offering an economic alternative to slave wealth, as historians such as Alan Lester, Nikita Vanderbilt, Beth Robertson and Cam Coventry have begun to demonstrate. Wakefieldian principles were also applied to Caribbean former slave colonies such as Trinidad and British Guiana by those seeking to ensure the supply of a disciplined agricultural labour force. On Trinidad, for example, where in 1834 a vast amount of land remained uncultivated, Wakefield's theories were applied in seeking to keep workers on the plantations and prevent them from becoming small subsistence farmers. Prosperous Trinidad planter William Burnley wrote to the Colonial Secretary in January 1834, asking for regulations to prevent what he called the dispersion of the labouring classes over the ungranted lands of the colony. And indeed, he was successful in this request, because in 1836, the Colonial Secretary ordered West Indies colonial governors to fix such a price upon all Crown lands as may place them out of reach of persons without capital. Burnley also gave evidence to the 1836 Select Committee inquiring into the disposal of land in British colonies, and urged the adoption of systematic colonisation in the form of a high land price and large minimum acreage, because unless the availability of Trinidad's fertile land was restricted, freed blacks would not work. Burnley envisaged a Wakefieldian regime comprising workers of African blood from the Azores, the Canaries and Cape Verde, and free blacks from the United States, then being sent to Liberia as labourers. And when he gave evidence to the inquiry in 1836, he essentially said, you know, we'll all be ruined unless we apply Mr. Wakefield's scheme to the emancipated colonies. As we'll be hearing from other presenters over the next 2 afternoons, these links can also be traced to New Zealand and Canada. In another suggestive life story, Edward Ellis the Elder, known in his time as the Bear, received about £35,000 for the liberation of over 300 enslaved in Grenada, British Guiana, Tobago and Antigua. He was a director of the Hudson's Bay Company, and in 1825, Ellis became a director of the New Zealand Company that made the first attempt to colonise New Zealand. Ellis had been key to persuading King William IV to assent to abolition, despite the King's long-term opposition. So as a former naval officer, and like many members of the Royal Navy, the King was pro-slavery and had to be persuaded to assent to the new bill. Like the Wedderburn-Caldwell family, the Ellis's involvement in both West Indian plantation slavery and in the Hudson's Bay Company helped fund further investments in the new settler colonies. So in conclusion, these brief examples exemplify links between the end of Caribbean slavery and the dramatic expansion of the new Anglophone settler colonies, sometimes termed the Settler Revolution. By expanding our analysis of the anti-slavery campaign to include the concurrent and entwined process of establishing the new settler colonies, it's evident that they worked in tandem to stabilise the domestic social order and underwrite the conquest and administration of a growing empire. The interrelationship of debates about labour, land, transportation and settler colonisation maps the transition from slavery and its corollary transportation to a new model of settler colonisation and coercive wage labour. Thank you very much, and I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Jane, for a paper that was very rich and also, I have to say, perfectly timed. We're going to move on, as I said, straight on to Matthew Birchall's paper, and then I've noticed that a few questions and comments have come up in the chat and the Q&A. Please do put any questions for Jane or for Matthew as he gives his paper in the Q&A, where it's particularly easy for us to track them. So I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Matthew Birchall as our second speaker for this session. Matthew is currently a research fellow at the New Zealand Initiative, where he works on infrastructure and the housing market. But his historical writing has focused on Edward Gibbon Wakefield and settler capitalism, and it's been published in the Journal of Global History and Global Intellectual History. And he completed his PhD at the University of Cambridge in 2021. Matthew's paper today is called The Moral Economy of Company Colonisation. I'm not sure if you've got slides, Matthew, and you want to share? No, okay.
That's simple.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Zoe, and it's a pleasure not to think about infrastructure for an hour or so on a Tuesday evening. And I'd like to thank Jane for a wonderful paper and for organising, and also Denise as well. Today, I want to talk about corporate culture in relation to two agricultural trading companies that were established during the economic boom of 1824-25, the Australian Agricultural Company and the Van Diemen's Land Company. Although it is frequently assumed that companies only concern themselves with profit and loss, the corporate archive of these firms suggests that such an approach is in important respects misplaced. I will argue that if we historicise corporate culture from the perspective of the men who sat at the boardroom table, a different picture of joint stock capital emerges. Money-making was of course important, but so too was the idea of the corporation as a moral community. I'm going to do three things this evening. First, I will begin by spending a few minutes discussing how character talk shaped firm identity. And here I will pay particular attention to gentility and manners. Then I will pivot to the colonial frontier, where I will discuss how the two firms managed their convict workforce. Finally, I will conclude with some tentative reflections about the implications of taking the moral dimensions of company colonisation seriously. A brief note, however, I won't speak this evening about settler-Indigenous relations. Much could obviously be said about the impact of these companies had on Indigenous peoples, especially in Van Diemen's Land, and I do so elsewhere. However, my intention tonight in Wellington is to draw attention to some aspects of company colonisation that have been less well traversed. First, to the importance of character talk. In the manner of Kane and Hopkins, I argue that gentility had a strong cultural resonance in the City of London during the 1820s and 1830s. By virtue of class and wealth, the men who founded these companies were predisposed to view business enterprise as part and parcel of a public career. A significant number were MPs or directors of the Bank of England, for example. In this social context, the idea of character and the cluster of values it embraced mattered enormously. The respectability of the corporation, after all, depended on the moral fibre of the men who composed it. Let me make my point with a short discussion of the Australian Agricultural Company's nomination process. When the shareholders met to replace a director and auditor in 1826, the conversation was pregnant with self-reflection about the role of the board and the significance of character. Matthew Wood, an alderman and MP, observed that he thought it of the highest importance to the interests of a public company that the office of director should be filled by persons of commercial experience and respected by the citizens of London. Cornelius Buller, Governor of the Bank of England during the stock market bubble, and the company's auditor, was duly elected. His high character and important situation in the city were praised. John Abel Smith, an MP, founding partner in Jardine, Matheson and Company, and later director of the New Zealand Company, was unanimously appointed auditor. A man whose high respectability and talents were too well known to need any further remark upon this occasion. Abel Smith was the embodiment of the 19th century gentlemanly capitalist. But why was gentility prioritised? And what does it tell us about company colonisation? The insistence on character, I think, is related to the claims that these companies made on the public interest. Yes, they were financed by private capital, and yes, their primary concern was to turn a profit and reward shareholders. But that does not mean that we should interpret them in light of modern company law, which imposes statutory requirements on firms to maximise shareholder value. Joint stock companies were not then the dominant form of business enterprise in Britain. That only came after the railway mania of the 1840s and the advent of limited liability legislation in the 1860s. They were still, in the 1820s, hybrid institutions that assumed public as well as private functions. What is more, the two Antipodean companies were established in an economic world in which social status and reputation could not be ignored. To be known as a man of good standing was to possess the moral collateral which would reassure potential business associates or investors. Ditto for the corporation at large. As the directors of the Australian Agricultural Company remarked in a dispatch to Sydney, the firm was one of the few concerns that has continued to maintain the high character that it obtained at its commencement, and it is no less essential to the interest of the shareholder than to the character of the directors that it should continue, not only to preserve, but to increase the good opinion of the public. This concern with acting in the public good was closely allied to a commitment to probity. Indeed, both boards were at pains to show how they were corporations of repute, that is, that they were honest brokers. Hence the desire to distance themselves from the excesses of 1824-25, which had seen rampant corporate speculation. Some 600 companies were formed. After all, the stability and good name of the company depended on a reputation for prudence and sensible management, not commercial flights of fancy. Restraint was the watchword. This brings me to manners in the making of company men. Manners and comportment were an important part of the boardroom as a moral community, with directors expected to adhere to appropriate standards of conduct. Take John MacArthur Jr.'s assessment of Robert Dawson, the Australian Agricultural Company's first colonial agent. I think, my dear mother, that you will be pleased with Mr. Dawson. His manners are occasionally blunt, but he is in truth unassuming and good-tempered. When Dawson was fired by the Colonial Committee for mismanagement of the company's flock, his manners were once again called into question. The propriety of company colonisation often pivoted around the axis of character. Bad behaviour, after all, could do reputational damage. To guard against this, the Van Diemen's Land Company included a provision to blackball a director in case of bankruptcy. If any director shall in any respect so conduct himself, as in the opinion of at least 6 of the directors to bring discredit upon himself, then the office of every such director shall immediately become vacant, as if he had resigned the same. The character of credit, to borrow Margot Finn's felicitous phrase, was alive and well in the company boardroom. Now to the moral economy of the company settlements. Here I want to acknowledge the work of Tony Ballantyne and Jane Lydon. Ballantyne's rich analysis of the disciplinary regimes fashioned by missionaries in the Bay of Islands shows how ideas about industriousness and the organisation of time were central to transforming Maori economic behaviour, while Lydon's investigation of the transition from slavery to settler colonisation reveals how practices of labour discipline drawn from the plantation informed proposals to colonise parts of Australia. I want to suggest that a similar approach can generate new insights about company colonisation. A good example concerns the management of the convict workers assigned to these companies. Especially vivid is the correspondence between the directors of the Van Diemen's Land Company and their principal agent, Edward Kerr. The court feel desirous to offer a few observations upon the general treatment of convicts, which they do with deference to the experience Mr. Kerr has acquired by his residence in the island of the character and habits of that description of persons. In particular, the directors encouraged Kerr to adopt a light touch with respect to the convict labourers, as they thought this would ultimately produce better results. You are aware how much His Majesty's government feel interested in improving the moral condition of these offenders. The court therefore recommend you to lay down for yourselves and your subordinate agents and servants such a system of discipline and control as, while it affords to the convicts every comfort compatible with their situation, shall inure them to habits of discipline, industry, and sobriety. Such moralising was accompanied by a system of incentives. Extra work on the company farm was rewarded with payment in the form of tea and sugar, for instance. But sweeteners were also accompanied by close observation. Both sets of directors expressed a strong interest in receiving regular reports on their convict workers, and one of the strategies that they employed was methodical bookkeeping. The effect of such a system, noted the Tasmanian Directorate, must be not only to promote the public advantage, but to make their labour more effectual and profitable. Upon this subject, they will expect to have frequent and ample reports from you. Labour discipline and moral reform were two sides of the same coin. To that end, the directors encouraged their colonial officials to file returns that encompass detailed reports on convict behaviour, including commentary on working habits and living conditions, all of which could be used to monitor the workforce with an unrivaled degree of precision. The court are glad to see your returns of convicts. This return tends to make the directors acquainted with the details and minutiae of the concern, and they would wish that similar returns should be annually made not only of the convicts, but of the free labourers with your observations on character. The company concluded with a recommendation to include such information in future reports, a paper panopticon, if you like, to help regulate the workforce. Some thoughts and reflections on the corporation as a moral community. The centrality of culture to the story I have told today raises an important question about the history of colonial capitalism, namely, how do we reconcile the idea of the corporation as a social and cultural institution with a concept that typically subordinates such forces to more financial impulses. The history of company colonisation, I think, troubles big picture histories of capitalism that prioritise capital over the capitalist. And very quickly here, I was delighted to see that Ben Huff was listening, and he has made some comments in this regard. Now, I don't want to suggest that we need to pick one over the other, but I do want to argue that more attention needs to be paid to the interplay between cultural norms and capital investment. Let me make my point with a brief discussion of the local shareholding policies of the Australian Agricultural Company and the Van Diemen's Land Company. Just as the directors tried to secure political support at home, so access to colonial dignitaries was prized. And a tactic that both companies used was a special dispensation of 200 shares for colonial residents. The directors of the Van Diemen's Land Company were blunt about the policy's purpose. As it appears very desirable to interest some of the most respectable and influential colonists in the concerns of the company, the court have placed at your disposal, beyond the appropriation made to several individuals connected with the government, 200 shares in their joint stock, which they leave to the direction of the council to distribute in such a manner as may appear best calculated to conciliate the good wishes of the community in Van Diemen's Land. Critically, the shares were to be apportioned to those best placed to further the interests of the company and the colony. They further desire that you apportion these shares with reference to the situation, character, and means of the individual. The company's rationale for local shareholding emphasised the social value of the policy, not its financial outcomes. What really mattered was the dispensation of colonial shares worked to bolster social status. As the Australian Agricultural Company's colonial establishment relayed with obvious relish, it will be satisfactory to you and to the proprietors in general to learn that the opinion of the state of the company's affairs in the colony is very favourable. Several persons of respectability here are desirous to obtain shares. Company colonisation, I have tried to argue, is as much about social and cultural status as it is about money making. The men who founded these companies united the power of capital and the power of the corporation to exert dominance across the seas. But they also created communities, what their early modern predecessors called corporate commonwealths. In making this argument, I've tried to foreground some important aspects of the corporation as a moral community, as my actors regarded it. Character talk was instrumental in shaping firm identity and behaviour, with gentility and manners to the fore. And so was the moral reform of their convict workforce. An appreciation of the moral economy of company colonisation helps to give corporeal life to the corporation, and it potentially opens up new ways of thinking about colonial capitalism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew. I'll return us to well, if I can, a screen where you're not finding yourself quite so highlighted, and we can move to the questions. I can see a couple in the Q&A and also some comments in the chat. And of course, I just want to remind you that we're taking questions for both Jane and Matthew. We've got a good 20 minutes before we take a break. But I'd like to begin, if exercise the chair's prerogative, Matthew, by just asking you to gloss this vision of the moral economy of the corporation with reference to the elephant in the room in terms of your work, which is, of course, Edward Gibbon Wakefield, who, you know, is a man of scurrilous reputation. And just how you see whether it's different by the mid-1830s from the mid-1820s, or whether this is an effort on Wakefield's part at kind of moral rehabilitation, or whether we should think more about the efforts of all those around him to try and kind of unsuccessfully downplay Wakefield's involvement.
That's a really good point. And, you know, most of my work has focused on Wakefield, and part of my interest in this moral question, I mean, you know better than most people, Zoe, James Stevens' papers, which are in the Cambridge University Library, and looking at letters where he's talking about what a sort of scurrilous rogue Wakefield is, and that was quite fascinating, because it was, you know, they're talking about these very serious things about, you know, claiming new worlds and stuff, but part of this discussion will boil down to, I don't trust this guy, and he's bad, and that sort of thing. And so to sort of backtrack a little bit, when I'm talking about the moral economy, I'm interested in, you know, the presentation that my actors had of themselves. And, you know, we have good reason to be very skeptical, but when we're talking about a moral grammar, it's, you know, it's okay, we're very virtuous on the one hand, but, you know, these people are bad. So often these companies will snipe at one another. And so there's a discussion about immoral behavior as well as moral behavior. And I'm really just interested in trying to recuperate that. And to answer your question more directly, I think, yeah, when dealing with Wakefield, you have to reckon with that, you know, aspect of he totally sullied his reputation for good reasons, and he was, you know, continuously working behind the scenes because he couldn't be out in front, and yeah.
You're muted, I think, Zoe.
I am indeed. It's been delightfully too long since I've chaired a Zoom meeting. Jane, is your point related to Matthew's?
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question of Matthew, but I don't want to jump the queue either, so not sure. I see there are a couple of, actually Angela Walcott has just asked the exact same question I was going to. So
can you see that, Matthew? The question is...
Yeah, I can. I've thought about this.
I'll just read the question because I'm not sure that all our audience will see, which is that Lyndall Ryan has studied these two same companies and their treatment of Indigenous people and found significant contrasts. What contrast do you see between them?
This is a wonderful paper. It's in, I think it's Penny Edmonds' book, co-edited book, where she's contrasting the Australian Agricultural Company and the Van Diemen's Land Company. I have a slightly different take on this, having worked through the archives of both companies, and I think Lyndall's paper is excellent in many respects, but I think she does perhaps strain to make a claim about how important Indigenous labour was to the Australian Agricultural Company in the first instance. Her argument is that the Australian Agricultural Company, it's been a while since I've read her paper, but the Australian Agricultural Company was somehow more benevolent and enlightened than the Van Diemen's Land Company. And, you know, the Van Diemen's Land Company is a pretty low bar. But when I, had a sort of wonderful 3 or so weeks at the Noel Butlin archives, systematically going through the Australian Agricultural Company's minute books, at no point did I think that Aboriginal labour was central to this corporation. And so I think this is an instance of historiographical questions shaping how you then go on and interpret primary sources in a way that I think does actually misrepresent how this corporation undertook its business. But that's just my interpretation.
Thank you, Matthew. We'll go to Jane, and then I've got a question from Tony Ballantyne. So Jane first.
Yeah, no, I just was going to add to that. My understanding is that I think Linda was also looking at who composed the different shareholder, the boards, what do you call them? And she noted things like the presence of abolitionists on the board of the Australian Agricultural Company, for example, as opposed to Van Diemen's Land Company. So it might be a different perspective.
I think that's a really good point, Jane, and that's quite correct. But it's when you try and link that profile of investors to company behaviour, right? Exactly, because if they still take the Van Diemen's Land Company, they could have had the most benevolent board in London, but if you have Edward Kerr, well, it's not going to be that pretty on the ground. So that's just the objection that I have, but it's a wonderful paper.
Jane, I just noticed that there's a series of comments there from Gary Lafergie in the Q&A, raising the question, and these were put up in connection to your paper, about the Black colonisation movement from America. And I think they're referring to some of the people who were promoted, for example, Liberia and other schemes, and talking about, I guess, the complexities of some of these settler colonial schemes that were very directly connected to US slavery. I don't know if you want to respond to that or just take that as... I'm aware of this issue, and it has come up before in this kind of discussion. So I do think it is quite a salutary point to acknowledge the way that some of these experiments, these schemes, were being advanced, in different places as people tried to resolve questions of abolition and labour. So yeah, thank you for that. Appreciate that. Then we've got a question from Tony Ballantyne for Matthew. says, I wonder how far this moral economy was related to and reacting to long-standing arguments and contexts over the character of company colonialism. I'm thinking in particular of the East India Company and the hammering it took in the wake of the Hastings trial, for example.
Oh, that's such a wonderful, wonderful question. And I wish I had found something where they were referring to the Hastings trial, but I didn't. I mean, it would be fascinating to sort of knit together a history of company colonization and character in different contexts, and sort of prize out, you know, things that are common and whatnot. But in my specific context, strangely, they make no reference to, as far as I'm aware of, they make no reference to Hastings, which is quite interesting now that I reflect upon it, because many of the individuals are involved in parliamentary select committees, right? And so that would probably be one forum in which, you know, that would sort of prompt going back to Hastings. Yeah, I'll have to think a little bit more about this question, Tony, and perhaps write to you, because I hadn't thought about that.
Thank you, Matthew. And Tony said, thank you, I think.
Yeah.
Not everything is connected. Well, that's true. Often it
yeah.
does seem as if it is in some way or other. Jane Deborah Oxley has just put in a new book on Liberia there in the chat. And I, of course, would reference my own work on that. There's a chapter in Protecting Humanity as well. Have we got any other? I've got web chat, Q&A, everything's open.
There is a question from Mariha Nisa, if I can jump in there. In understanding contemporary engagement of development of Indigenous and tribal peoples' lived experiences, how would the vocabulary of settler colonisation be redefined in terms of dispossession, violence and resistance? And that's a great question. And I mean, I think the first thing is we'd say that it wasn't wastelands in the colonies. We're talking about the theft of Indigenous land, first and foremost. So we now see these terms very differently. Matthew, you might have something to say.
No, I entirely agree with you, Jane, and I think I would just add, you know, there's a comment saying the moral definitions of themselves, and that's very much what I've been focused on trying to recapture. But yeah, I think you've answered it better than I could.
And I think also, Zoe, just to refer back to your book, you make the point, I think you show the way that Hodgkins and the Aborigines Protection Society was kind of seeking to inject a humanitarian element into the Wakefield schemes, but it was largely about rhetoric. And, you know, there was this, these were not good faith discussions. Is that how you would put it? Or?
Well, the idea of the self-fashioning of these metropolitan men is really interesting, and they're all very conscious and protective of their own, you know, what they see as their own probity. The British humanitarians take great issue. They're constantly sucked into these, supporting these colonisation companies and schemes, and then frequently and quite reasonably disappointed. And then, you know, get very het up because they feel that their own status has been impugned by these, impugned by these, you know, the reckless and immoral activities of others overseas. I don't think they have any particular, well, I don't think they really occupy the moral high ground either. But it is, I mean, Matthew, I think your paper really does raise the question of how these people saw themselves, how these colonizers saw themselves. But as the chat is running hot, it shows that, you know, it all sounds a bit sort of hypocritical, frankly.
It's you know, these debates, it's contested terrain, right? And so when I read, you know, for instance, your wonderful chapter on Australand and New Zealand, it's exactly as you describe. You get the perspective from the Aboriginal Protection Society and how they've, been sullied by being co-opted by these unscrupulous capitalists. And I've not looked at the APS papers. I've just looked at colonial office records and the company records. And I was always fascinated by putting the self-reflections of the company men into conversation with how the colonial office thought about these things, and what I was learning from, you know, all the great scholarship on these issues. And so I think, the important thing is potentially as historians is, you know, not necessarily to be taking a really strong moral position on these debates. It's just about trying to recover them and present them as honestly as we can.
Thank you. Jane, do you want to add anything there? And thank you. If people were looking for the book on Liberia that's just been published, that's now in the webinar chat, so you should be able to see that. It's quite challenging for me to have the chat and the Q&A, I've got to say. Jane, did you want to reflect?
Sorry.
Oh, well, on what Matthew was just saying, or else if we've got any other, as far as I can see,
Ooh,
we have.
I did have one question for Jane, if that's all right.
Absolutely.
I was really interested about what connections Wakefield had to abolitionist circles, both, I guess, socially, but also intellectually. I wonder if you could just comment on, you know, how he was sort of rubbing up against these folks.
That's a great question. Thank you. Yeah, I hadn't actually explicitly formulated that. He came from a kind of reforming family that was very well known. Tony, again, has written about Wakefield's and sort of noted that too. And I've already mentioned his grandmother, Priscilla. So he was quite, he was very well connected in a kind of, in some ways. And so he was certainly very familiar with these debates and would have been very careful, I imagine, not to adopt an explicitly pro-slavery view. And then as time went on, I think the colonial reformers are interesting because some of them had direct links to slavery and were quite substantial beneficiaries. So I mentioned Edward Ellis, you know, the bear, and the Canadian link. But part of our sort of team project has been to track down, you know, a range of these links, and, you know, a number of people with greater or lesser kind of links to the West Indies and who were beneficiaries of slavery compensation. But then there are others with none at all, you know, so they're pure and they have a long-term association with abolition. So I think that's a really interesting question. And Wakefield was a very slippery character who was able to persuade and charm and sort of even modify his argument. So I think in the very earliest iterations of his scheme, he's talking quite explicitly about racialised labour forces and bringing in non-white labour forces to work, you know, even in Swan River and in Australand and so on. And he's sort of advocating for the you know, the benefits of Chinese or labour and so forth. But then he quite quickly drops that. And you know, we know that in 1837, the British government makes, you know, a white Australia its official policy. And then in future years, I think Wakefield is quite sort of, you know, expedient in dropping those aspects of his policy and then arguing that this is a solution that allows, for the abolition of slavery. But anyway, so I haven't actually pursued that, but I will look out for that in a more systematic way in future. Thank you.
Thank you both. I'm just going to draw this session to a close. And for all our attendees, this marks a point in the morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you are in the world. But the main point is that we're going to have a 30-minute pause so people can grab some refreshments appropriate to their time zone. And then we're going to reconvene for our third and final session for today, which is going to be 2 papers from Angela Woolacott and Rowan Howitt. So I'd like to thank very much Jane and Matthew for 2 really stimulating papers and very generous responses to the questions, and urge everyone to come back in 30 minutes. I think probably the best thing to do, if you're able to, is leave your Zoom links on and just mute yourselves and then rejoin us in half an hour. So thank you both.
Great. Thank you, Zoe, and thank you, Jane.
Thank you both. That was great.
All right. I would like to say hello to everybody. My name is Jeremy Martins from UWA, and I'm looking forward to chairing our session, the second afternoon session of From Slavery to Colonisation, Land and Labour. Before I do that, though, I'd just like to acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people as the traditional owners of the UWA Crawley campus from where I'm speaking to you. And the Whadjuk Noongar remain the spiritual and cultural custodians of their land and continue to practice their values, languages, beliefs, and knowledge. Welcome to our speakers today, Angela Woolacott and Rowan Howitt. What we're going to do today is we're going to go in the order on the program. Angela will speak first, followed by Rowan, and then we'll have questions at the end. Each presenter has 20 minutes. And I'll just quickly introduce both presenters now to allow for a kind of seamless transition from one presentation to the next. So Angela Woolacott is the Manning Clark Professor of History at ANU. She's an elected fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia and the Australian Academy of the Humanities, and a former president of the AHA. Her most recent monograph is Don Dunstan, the Visionary Politician Who Changed Australia, and her book, from which her research on Australand stems, is Settler Society in the Australian Colonies, Self-Government and Imperial Culture. Dr. Rowan Howitt is a postdoc fellow in the Centre for Environmental History at the ANU. His research focuses on the intersection of colonial and environmental histories in the region bounded by Australia, New Zealand, Antarctica, and the Southern Ocean. And his work has appeared in History Workshop Journal and Australian Historical Studies. Welcome both of you, and I'd like now to pass over to Angela. As with the previous session, please put your questions, if you have them, while the speakers are speaking, in either the chat or the question and answer tab, and we will return to those at the end. So passing on to you. Thank you very much, Angela.
Is that showing okay?
Yes, it's showing.
Good. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Let me begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from the land of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. In Australia, there would be just 2 Wakefieldian settlements. Regarded as the less successful version of Wakefield's idea, and perhaps for that reason largely overlooked in Australian history, was the Western Australian settlement of Australand. Australand was established in 1840 by the Western Australian Company, just north of Port Leschenault or Bunbury. The very name of Australand was significant, concocted to signify the settlement's location on the Australian coast, in a situation that was hoped would foster a relationship between Australia and India. The name, in fact, being a contraction of Australia and India, Australand would represent the possibilities of trade and exchange between these 2 parts of the British Empire on the periphery of the Indian Ocean. Just like South Australia, Australand was founded on the careful plans and schemes of a group of men in London. Maps were drawn up, plans made for a supposedly ideal town, a prospectus compiled, and much effort put into advertising the colony. The company's prospectus showed the town as the planners intended it to be laid out, with formal streets, public squares, wharves, marketplaces, even colleges, a hospital, a theatre, a town hall, and 6 churches. 100-acre farms were sold in London ahead of the settlement being established, off the plan, as it were. As in South Australia, the proceeds of land sales were to be used to pay for the passages of labourers, as well as improvements to the town. The settlers who sailed were thus a mix of the more affluent elite of the colony and those intended to do the labour. It was a community that would have clear class lines, and in fact it would develop a fundamental racial division based on the unpaid employment and then the criminalisation of the local Aborigines. One of the main proponents of the Wakefield scheme was Henry Samuel Chapman, a lawyer who had lived in London and who would become a prime advocate for responsible government in Australia. In 1841, Chapman published a book extolling the land at the first mooted location for Australasia, Port Grey, so that's the top arrow there, as the best possible and most felicitous site, titled The New Settlement of Australand, with a map.
Sorry, Angela, I'm sorry to interrupt. We only just see your screen with the front, the first slide. We can't actually see the other slides being changed. I apologise for interrupting.
So you're not seeing the...
We're just seeing, or I am on mine anyway, just your opening slide, and it's not the actual slideshow that we're seeing. We're just seeing.
If you click on the little logo below the image on the right.
Yeah, maybe that might work a bit better.
Sorry,
the one next to the open book. You know, the icon that looks like the open book. The one to the right. If you push that one, that might help. I'm not sure. Otherwise, if that doesn't work, if you can go back to, you get your computer out of the presentation and then just go through manually to each slide. Yes, that's changing.
Is it changing now?
We just see a little, no, unfortunately we don't see we've just got a kind of, yes, that's it, perfect.
Are you seeing a proper full slide now?
Well, I don't know. We're not really seeing a full slide, but we're seeing a much better. Yes, that's great. I think if you can keep going now. Thank you.
That's good.
Are you still just getting the...
Well, we can see it now, which is important. Before we weren't seeing any of the slides, so I think this will do rather than fluffing about and trying to make it bigger. But I think this should be fine.
Okay, so there's no way of showing you the full slide that...
There probably is, but how exactly? You might have to mirror screens on your end or something like that. But
okay,
I'm not sure.
All right. All right, so now that we've established that, so I'm glad that you brought that to my attention. Thank you. So back to, I was pointing out that Chapman was talking about Port Grey as the first intended site for Australand, and that's the top arrow there. And his book was titled The New Settlement of Australand, with a map of the district and a full description of the colony and of the principles on which it is settled, compiled for the use of colonists. Chapman emphasised its agricultural potential. Based on the observations of George Gray and others about the region, he predicted that it would grow olives, grapes for wine, and fruit ranging from oranges and other citrus to figs, and mulberries for silk, that almond and other nut trees would grow, that cotton, rice and tobacco were all possible crops, and that the wool industry would flourish there. Chapman acknowledges that Chapman acknowledges that labour will be an issue for Australand, and notes that Sir James Stirling, the former governor of Western Australia, advocated that sugar and cotton could be grown in the northern section of the colony, quote, by means of free labour to be procured from Hindustan or the neighbouring islands of the Malay archipelago, end quote. Chapman does not expand on this, Yet we know that labourers were brought to Western Australia from various parts of South and Southeast Asia. Historian F.K. Crowley, for example, says that some settlers in Western Australia in these years brought with them a, quote, small number of Indian and Chinese coolies, end quote. Most discussion of Edward Gibbon Wakefield has centred on his scheme for the sale of colonial, quote, wastelands, unquote, to fund the emigration of poor British labourers. His notions of when labourers should be enabled to buy their own land, and the vexed issue of the sufficient price of colonial lands. These aspects of Wakefield's schemes have been thoroughly rehearsed by historians, but Wakefield and his followers' enthusiasm to include Indian, Chinese, and Pacific Island labourers in their visions of systematic colonisation has been largely overlooked. Wakefield drew comparisons among slavery, convict transportation, and indentured labour. Quote, every colony has enjoyed in some measure what I have termed combination and constancy of labour. They enjoyed it by means of some kind of slavery. In the greater part of the English colonies in North America, Negro slavery counteracted the scarcity of labour for hire. In New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land, there has been convict slavery. In the colonies of North America, where Negro slavery was not at all or not largely established, there has been a virtual slavery in the forms of servants kidnapped in Europe and indented in America, a contract bound to their masters for a term of years. Now, as was mentioned in earlier discussion, it's not surprising that Wakefield should have commented on slavery and its wrongs, given that he had been born into a family of Quakers with strong reform traditions and proclivities for contributing to public discussion. One of Wakefield's cousins was prison reformer Elizabeth Fry, and another married Thomas Fowell Buxton, the great anti-slavery activist. Wakefield's enthusiasm for the possibility of Pacific Islander, Indian and Chinese labourers in the new British settlements in the Southern Oceans is evident in a postscript to his 1829 letter from Sydney. This is a long quote. I've got it there, but I'm going to read it through quickly. Excuse me. Many of the islands of the Pacific Ocean have a superabundant population who, constantly exposed to the want of food, would rejoice to emigrate to this country and to supply our urgent want of labourers, if we did but offer them a free passage and plenty to eat. The British dominions in India might afford us a much larger supply, for though hitherto the Hindus have been disinclined to emigrate, the most careless observer must see that a great moral revolution has commenced in British India, that the obstinate prejudices of the ages are there beginning to disappear, and that but little management would be required to induce the poorest class of Hindus to labour and enjoy in Australia. But the Chinese, especially, who with a population of 300 million, feel the pressure of people upon territory more than any other nation whatsoever, who are greatly disposed to emigrate, and who are by far the most industrious and skillful of Asiatics, might not only supply the wants of labourers now felt in the British Australasian settlements, but they might in the course of the century perhaps convert the whole of this enormous wilderness into a fruitful garden. The labouring classes in China, I am credibly informed, frequently make offers to the masters of English ships to bind themselves to labour without wages during 3 days in the week for a term of years in return for a free passage to any British settlement. There might be a constant immigration of Chinese labourers at every settlement in Australasia, end quote. And Jane referred to this, thinking about Chinese settlers earlier. Speaking of Jane and her work, Jane has shown the political and economic connections between the abolition of slavery and Wakefield's systematic colonisation, with Wakefield contending that systematic colonisation, quote, systematic colonisation was the only practical means of abolishing slavery, end quote. Further, his allusions to settlers in Australia, quote, secretly longing for a trade in human flesh, end quote, Jane points out were only half playful. She draws on these aspects of Wakefield's writing in establishing her argument for the, quote, structural and causal relationship, end quote, between plantations in the Caribbean and labour systems in the new settler colonies. That the relationship was causal is clear from the rapid growth of settler colonialism, convict transportation, and indentured labour during the years that plantation slavery was ameliorated and then ended. That it was structural, Jane argues, is seen in the connections across systems, such as systems of discipline for unfree labour, and in concern with new imperial investment opportunities, including the investment of some compensation payouts. We can see this too in continuing interest by Wakefield, his supporters and others, in hierarchies of labour based on race as well as class. The broader connections that we need to see here are not only those across systems of unfree labour in the British Empire. Claire Anderson, in her magisterial survey of convict transportation in world history, points to the 18th and 19th century connections among the French, Spanish and British empires in their systems of unfree labour. These included the ways that all three empires sometimes transported slaves or former slaves and were influenced by each other's practices. Anderson describes instances of connections across places and systems as a carceral loop. One connection between the British and Spanish empires was from 1822, when, with Spanish colonies in the Americas gaining their independence and refusing to accept transported slaves, British Caribbean colonies transported felons to England for transshipment to the Australian penal colonies. This makes me wonder what Wakefield and his supporters, like Henry Chapman, actually knew about the realities of unfree labour in Australia's region in the 1820s and 1830s. Did their connections in reforming circles and the networks around the Colonial Office provide them with information on practices to Australia's north? Did they know, for example, about the continuation in the 1820s of the slave trade in Singapore? We know about this from the autobiography of Abdullah bin Abdul Qadir, known as Munshi Abdullah, employed as a scribe for the British India Company in the Straits Settlements, working for Stamford Raffles, among others. Abdullah describes, quote, the season when the Bugis come to Singapore, end quote. He recounts visiting a boat in the Singapore harbour in the early 1820s, loaded with 300 to 400 enslaved Bugis and Balinese men, women and children who were being sold to Chinese, Indian and Malay purchasers and were being beaten by their captors. Other boats brought enslaved people from Siak. When Abdullah reported to Raffles what he had seen, Raffles assured him that the British Parliament would soon put an end to it, suggesting that this was a way in which the British would rule the region better than the Dutch had. So even though Henry Chapman referred to, quote, free labour to be procured from Hindustan or the neighbouring islands of the Malay archipelago, end quote, did he have in mind that labourers in the latter region had been enslaved and sold in recent years and were thus available cheaply? And what might Chapman and others have known of the Spanish Empire's trans-Pacific slave trade? Recent scholarship has revealed the significance of the Manila galleon trade in connecting Asia and the Americas, not only with commodities like silver, but also, as Tatiana Sages has shown, with the enslaved Asians known in Mexico as chinos or indios chinos. And a research project being conducted at Australian Catholic University by Christy Flannery suggests that the Manila-based slave trade continued as late as 1850. One connection between Australand and the early modern Spanish Empire in the Americas is racialized terminology. Australand's chief commissioner was Marshal Waller Clifton, and his large family were at the settlement's core. Clifton's eldest daughter, Louisa, kept a journal that gives us glimpses of the early settlement, including its dependence on local Aborigines, whom she called either natives or Indians, in the undifferentiating terminology applied to Indigenous peoples from Christopher Columbus's first voyage onwards. At one point, Louisa refers to the, quote, Kumbana Road, which Papa had set some Indians to clear, end quote. Her mixed usage leads to some ambiguity, such as her journal entry for the 21st of June 1841, when she refers to, quote, the store which a native informs Papa has been broken up by some Indians and 3 casks of flour stolen, end quote. Are the native and the Indians from the same group or not? The fact that by Indians she means Aborigines becomes clear elsewhere in the journal. Her father, Waller Clifton's racial categorization is not always entirely clear either. Was the, quote, Black Tom, end quote, who became his household servant on the 22nd of September, an Aboriginal man or Indian? Louisa Clifton seems to have developed some sympathy for Aborigines, but the ambiguity in her terminology suggests a conceptual blurring of groups of non-white labourers. While labourers from India were employed in the nearby region, I haven't seen any evidence that they worked at Australand itself. Instead, Australand turned to various ways of enticing or forcing Aborigines to augment the English labourers in their own community. Yet, according to a contemporary observer, Aborigines and the South Asian labourers in the Australand area seem to understand each other much sooner than the white settlers understood the Aborigines. As early as 1838, the Western Australian government began a system of criminalising Aboriginal men, punishing any act that could be interpreted as resistance to settlers or infringement of settlers' property, as well as inter-Aboriginal conflict with imprisonment. And first of all, a warning for any First Nations viewers that the following photos include images of people who have died. The colonial government took advantage of geography to turn Wodjumap or Rottnest Island, off the coast not far from the Swan River, into an Aboriginal prison. Between 1838 and 1904, more than 5,000 Aboriginal men were imprisoned on the island in a system which turned Aborigines into convicts and removed them from their country during the period when British invasion of this vast colony was at its most rampant. As Anita King has demonstrated, Rottnest Island exemplifies how the modern evolution of the prison was tied to settler colonialism and the dispossession of Indigenous people. Australand struggled severely in its first years. Whereas in December 1842, its population was about 350, by October 1846, it had dropped to only 76. According to Edward Landor, who visited Australand in December 1842, the reason that the settlement failed to fulfil its founders' hopes was clear. The land allotments were too small for profitable farming. In 1846, the shareholders of the company decided to dissolve it, although it continued to exist legally until the 1870s. Australand did stay afloat, even if it did not become the Wakefieldian utopia its planners had envisaged. The 1848 census in Western Australia showed Australand rebounding with a population of 4,622. By 1850, Australand and other parts of Western Australia had become so desperate for labourers that they decided to accept adult convicts from Britain, even as the eastern colonies either had ended or were trying hard to end convict transportation. Also, Aboriginal labour continued to be used. We know about the Aboriginal mailman used in the Bunbury region from 1848 to 1852. As early as August 1841, Waller Clifton first suggested the establishment of such a postal service, and later in 1848 suggested a plan for Aboriginal mail carriers between Fremantle and Bunbury. The scheme was indeed implemented, with Aboriginal convicts being released from Wodjumap or Rottnest Island, from the Perth Road Gang and elsewhere to serve out their sentences by carrying the mail on these southern routes. It was also extended to other routes. The Aboriginal mailmen were given just rations of flour and meat, sometimes tobacco, sometimes they wore government-supplied uniforms. It was arduous physical labour, as various commentators observed. Thus, we can see in the small systematic colony of Australand a microcosm of the global picture in which settler colonialism linked systems of unfree and underpaid labour in the wake of abolition. Elsewhere in the Australian colonies at this time, small groups of indentured labourers from India and China were employed, part of the global rise of indenture. For Australand, Wakefield and his boosters had looked around the region for potential sources of labour and perhaps to other empires for models. Despite its name, the struggling community did not find its solution in labourers from India, but rather in at first relying on undercompensated Aboriginal labour, then criminalising Aboriginal men and turning them into convicts. Calling Aboriginal people Indians not only showed a disinterest in them, it relegated them to being part of an undifferentiated global Indigenous class to be exploited and imprisoned even as they were dispossessed. Thank you. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can go over to Rowan.
Thanks, Angela. This set up. Okay, if there's any problems with the share, just let me know. And before I get started,
I think it looks good.
Looks good.
Thanks. Yeah.
Thanks, Jeremy. And I'll just, before I get started, acknowledge that I am joining you from unceded Dharawal country today. So the Auckland Islands are, by I think most normal considerations, an unlikely site for a settler colony. The 8 islands that make up the archipelago are located 465 kilometres south of New Zealand. They are fully exposed to the brutal westerlies known as the Furious 50s that sweep the sub-Antarctic region of the Southern Ocean, so winds rarely drop below 60 kilometres an hour. And the islands experience 320 days of rain each year. The archipelago comprises 625 square kilometres of land, and the west coast is rugged, with cliffs rising from the sea to heights of 600 metres. And while the east coast rises more gently, it is ringed by a belt of dense southern rata forest and virtually impenetrable scrub, which you can get a sense of here. The highlands of the interior look like grassy plains from afar, but are in fact dominated by boggy wetlands. But in spite of their remote location and hostile environment, the Auckland Islands formed, for a brief period from 1849 to 52, the southeastern corner of British settler colonisation in Australasia. And this short-lived settlement project was undertaken by a London-based chartered company, the Southern Whale Fishery Company, which sought to simultaneously develop a dedicated whaling station in the heart of the hitherto underutilised sub-Antarctic whaling grounds and an agrarian settler colony informed by Wakefieldian principles of systematic colonisation. The result was, spoiler alert, an unmitigated disaster characterised by labour unrest, crippling disputes and dire returns, resulting in the colony's abandonment in 1852. But while it was short-lived and spectacularly unsuccessful, I would argue that the colonisation of the Aucklands fits into the wider pattern of the reorientation of the British Empire in the 1830s and 1840s, and as such, I suggest that it can provide some useful insights into these wider processes. And perhaps surprisingly, for such a windswept remote location, the colony in 1849 was actually the third attempt at settlement on these islands. The first was in around 1350 by Polynesian seafarers who remained on the island for probably 1 or 2 summers before abandoning it. They were then rediscovered in 1806 by a whaling captain working for the British company Enderby and Sons. This rediscovery triggered a sealing boom between 1806 and 1838. And one of the temporary visitors during that sealing boom, a Maori sealer called Matiuru, began to conceive that perhaps these islands could be suitable for permanent settlement again. Matiuru's people, Ngāti Mutuna, were originally from the Taranaki region of the North Island of New Zealand, but after being driven off their lands, they invaded the Chatham Islands in 1835, together with another Taranaki people, Ngāti Tama. And most of the Moriori, the people of the Chathams, were killed or enslaved during that invasion. In 1843, perhaps because of land shortages on the Chathams, Matauru hired a ship and led a party of 40 Maori, mostly Ngāti Motunga, and 25 enslaved Moriori to settle on the Aucklands. They built 2 pa, or villages, at the northern end of the islands. I don't know if you can actually see my mouse, but it's Enderby Island up in the northeastern tip, and then just across from there at Port Ross. Conditions were harsh for these 2 settlements. Producing food was a constant struggle. They could only produce basically cabbages, turnips, and potatoes the size of marbles. And with the sealing boom over, there wasn't a single ship that called at the islands over the next 6 years. So these settlers were entirely isolated. And at the same time as Matauru was leading the settlement of the Aucklands, a Londoner called Charles Enderby was developing his own plans for them. Enderby was the 3rd generation director of the whaling company Enderby and Sons, which had risen to prominence in the Atlantic whaling industry in the late 18th century, before it had turned to pioneering new whaling grounds off Australia and New Zealand. By the 1830s, though, the company's profits had dwindled significantly, and this persuaded Enderby of the need to restructure the British whaling industry and reorient it conclusively from Atlantic to the South Pacific. He therefore began calling for the remaining British whaling firms and investors to form a single joint stock company, which would construct a permanent settlement on the Auckland Islands amidst the Antarctic whaling grounds. This would boost efficiency and profit margins, such that Enderby predicted an initial fleet of 50 ships would be providing a profit of £278,000 within 2 years. He then predicted that this could be progressively scaled up until it reached his preferred size of a permanent fleet of 600 whaling vessels based on these islands. And Enderby's vision went far beyond establishing just a whaling station. As well as managing a whaling company, he had a wide range of interests. He was a founding member of the Royal Geographical Society. He was a prolific pamphleteer writing about economic reform. And he was very interested in Wakefield's ideas of systematic colonisation and had been a minor investor in the New Zealand Company and the Western Australian Company. His proposals for the Aucklands therefore kind of reflected those interests. He called for a colony of sober, industrious, skilled craftsmen and seamen to be drawn from the coastal communities of Britain and representing a balanced mix of occupations, classes and genders. Every colonist would be an employee of the company, contracted for a set term and paid fair wages, and all would be accompanied by their families. Even the whaling crews, who would normally sign up for a single voyage in exchange for a share of the profits, would be waged company employees instead. And upon expiration of their contracts, employees would be given the opportunity to lease or purchase land in the colony. All land would initially be owned by the company, with land sales, as expected, used to fund an assisted migration scheme and a large program of public works. The first settlers would focus on clearing land for agriculture with a view to making the colony self-sufficient and eventually becoming a resupply port along the Southern Ocean shipping route. And to encourage investment, the colony would be a free port without taxes or duties. These ideas were first articulated in 1844, but were clearly influenced by Wakefield, albeit applied to the particular context of a remote whaling station. Enderby saw in his proposals an opportunity not just to revitalise British whaling, but also to implement his own ideas for the ideal settler colony and to sort of redeem the character of the whaling industry by reforming its conventional systems of labour. So I think the case of the Aucklands is an example of how what Tony Ballantyne describes as Wakefield's energising vision had an influence beyond the Wakefield's direct networks, stimulating and informing the proposals of other prospective colonial entrepreneurs like Enderby. In any case, Enderby secured a 30-year lease for the Auckland Islands in 1847 and immediately turned his attention to establishing a company to oversee the project. The initial prospectus, which had a whole range of fascinating endorsements, called for initial capital of £300,000 to outfit a fleet of 50 whaling vessels. That level of investment proved impossible to raise, though, forcing a radical downsizing from £300,000 to 100, and from a fleet of 50 to just 3. But even with this diminution of scale, Enderby secured a royal charter for the Southern Whale Fishery Company, which gave it the exclusive rights to colonise the islands, make and enforce laws for the administration of the colony, and to hunt whales and seals in the island's surrounding seas. The Crown was to be represented by a Lieutenant Governor, none other than the 52-year-old Charles Enderby himself, who was already going as the company's resident commissioner, but all expenses of government were to be met by the company. So the first fleet of company colonists arrived at Port Ross, a protected harbour at the northern end of the islands, gradually between the 4th and 27th of December 1849. And the first of many shocks for these colonists came when the passengers of the fastest ship were met by a Maori welcoming party who piloted the ship into the harbour. Enderby's promotional materials had stressed that the Aucklands were uninhabited, so this was a genuine surprise to most of the colonists. Enderby had also promised fine harbours and land ready for the ploughshare, so they were also quite surprised to find impenetrable scrub, swamps, brutal westerlies, and the fact that it rained every single day for the first month they were there. The colony had an inauspicious start, marked by various disasters and poor decisions, which I won't go into here. But despite this, the colony did make steady progress over the next 2 years. By December 1851, 20 acres of land had been cleared, 5 acres of farmland had been cultivated, and a mile of roads had been built. And the population had grown to roughly 300. The settlement also had 3 sectors, and here's the only existing painting of the settlement. To the left on this image is the commercial sector, and in the middle is the administrative region, and then the kind of residential district up in the hills above it. They'd also selected and surveyed a second site further north, which was designated to be the second town, to be named Hardwick, after the governor of the Court of Directors of the company. And this was where land was to be sold or leased to company veterans and new prospective settlers. In practice, though, it never really developed beyond some cottages and a cemetery. 2 large company farms had also been established, one to the north of Hardwick and the other across the bay on Enderby Island. But crucial to this colony's kind of growth and consolidation in this period were delicate negotiations between the company's 2 most senior officers, Enderby and William Mackworth, and the leading Māori chiefs on the islands, Matioro and Manaturi. Enderby and Mackworth initially attempted simply to assert the exclusivity of the company's title based on its royal charter, but very quickly they shift strategy to negotiating. After lengthy discussions, which were intermediated by George Cook, a Te Reo-speaking chief officer on one of the company's whaling ships, whose mother was Māori, and Enderby agreed to pay Matioro and Manaturi an indemnity and allow their peoples to continue growing crops freely in exchange for the chiefs signing an agreement renouncing any claim to the islands, recognising the company's ownership of the island's livestock, and agreeing to become company employees. They both signed on as special constables and were responsible for assisting Enderby to maintain law and order, which in practice meant that Enderby could send lawbreakers to Matioro or Manaturi to be held in their custody, which he used liberally to deal with protests that he faced over wages, rations and conditions. And over the next 2 years, most of the other male members of the Māori communities signed on as company employees as well. And they ultimately did much of the land clearing, construction, farming and boat handling in the settlement in exchange for wages, rations and access to the company's stores. Enderby did attempt to assert the primacy of company law in a few areas. Most notably, he issued a ban on Māori or Moriori from having guns, and he insisted that they also respect his ban on the sale of liquor in the colony. But in many cases, the company did just shy away from imposing settler law. And the clearest example of this was the company's permissive attitude towards slavery. The reason the Māori men could devote so much time to working in the company's settlement was the labour performed at the Māori pā by the 25 enslaved Moriori. Enderby, Mackworth and many other company settlers were regular visitors to the pā, and so were fully aware that the Moriori were enslaved workers, but they turned a blind eye to ensure the company could benefit from the labour performed by Māori workers. And this echoed the tacit toleration of slavery at the Chatham Islands, where Moriori continued to be enslaved until 1863, 2 decades after abolition in the territories of the East India Company, to contextualise it. Yet while the settler colonial project was progressing steadily, the whaling side of the company's operations was a disaster. By July 1851, the company had harvested 5,200 pounds of whale oil, as against expenses of over 98,000 pounds. This is a far cry from the 268,000 pound profit Enderby had promised. And on top of this, whaling in the sub-Antarctic region had produced no oil at all. Most of the oil that they had harvested was from whales caught off the coast of Japan, which had then been shipped back to the Auckland Islands and then shipped to London. Kind of a spectacularly inefficient system that really called into question the wisdom of basing the industry in the Aucklands. And Enderby's efforts to reform the practices of labour, of whaling labour through the ideas of systematic colonisation, were also a real drain on profitability. Enderby was morally opposed to the conventional system whereby whalers signed on for a single voyage and received a lay or share of the profits for that voyage. He instead tried to employ whalers on long-term contracts to the company, with the whalers and their families living at Port Ross and assigned to voyages or to shore duties according to the company's needs. This wasn't actually a terrible idea. It bears a close resemblance to how the Arctic and Antarctic whaling industries were reorganised in the 1890s and 1900s, but at this time it was incredibly unpopular. Most experienced whalers had no interest in giving up the profit-sharing lay system they were used to, had little intention of retiring to life as a market gardener in Hardwick, and loathed the idea of being restricted to the Auckland Islands, where rations were tight, liquor sales were restricted, and life was considered dull. Because of this, the company really struggled to compete with orthodox whaling voyages operating out of other Australasian ports. The Australian gold rushes added another layer of difficulty, with many whalers opting to try their luck at mining rather than signing up for Enderby's systematisation of whaling. So the company really struggled to recruit competent whalers and then faced constant complaints and strike actions from those who did sign on, further undercutting its operations. The end result is that the Court of Directors in London dispatched 2 special commissioners to inspect the settlement and, if they deemed it necessary, to abandon or to relocate it. Enderby and the special commissioners clashed almost immediately. And as their relationship deteriorated alarmingly, Enderby ended up locking himself in Government House and threatened to shoot the commissioners if they tried to enter. All 3 of them, in controversial circumstances, eventually departed for Wellington, where Enderby immediately launched legal action against them, which left William Mackworth to oversee the dismantling of the colony at the Aucklands. The company was liquidated in 1854, and once its assets were removed from the islands and sold, its debts were paid and the shareholders received only 15 shillings per original £50 share. The disastrous project led to the insolvency of Enderby and Sons as well, and ultimately to a decisive shift in the centre of the British whaling industry, from London to Australasia. There is some confusion about the company's dealings with the Māori and Moriori settlers during the abandonment. Mackworth claimed in his diary to have offered them a passage to New Zealand in company ships, which they declined. But another account from a visiting naval officer claims Mackworth refused Mataoro and Manaturi's repeated requests to leave with the company's settlers. In any case, the Māori and Moriori remained at the Aucklands when the company departed in 1852, though most left for Stewart Island in 1854, and the families of those who remained chartered a ship to bring them to the Chathams in 1856. I should stress this is a very brief overview of the colonisation of the Auckland Islands, which is the subject of a much larger research project, which I'd be only too happy to talk more about. It is a relatively obscure case study, but I argue that it's one that can provide useful insights into the wider reorientation of the British Empire in the aftermath of abolition. In particular, I think it's a useful reminder of the level of experimentation that accompanied the acceleration of settler colonisation in Australasia in this period. As Angela's work on Australind has demonstrated, experiments in systematic colonisation took place beyond the familiar roll call of South Australia, Wellington, Wanganui, Taranaki, Nelson, Otago, Canterbury. And as well as kind of existing beyond those places, they could also be more idiosyncratic in form and ambition than those more familiar settlements, in this case by integrating kind of Wakefieldism and whaling. And what Tony Ballantyne has called the energising vision of Wakefieldism was taken up beyond the direct networks of the Wakefields and provided the intellectual underpinnings for projects that aim to transform even the furthest margins of the Australasian world. The ultimate insignificance of the Auckland Islands as a settler colony is a reminder of the overarching significance of systematic colonisation. I also think that there are a couple of other insights to be gained from taking seriously the colonisation of the Aucklands. First, they provide an interesting case study for the complexity of abolition in an Australasian context. In addition to the shift to indentured labour in Australasia that's been the subject of super interesting recent work, overt slavery persisted into the 1850s and 60s on New Zealand's outlying islands, the Chathams and the Aucklands. And secondly, much of the focus on the geographical reorientation of the British Empire from west to east is focused on land and on terrestrial labour. But this period was also characterised by a reorientation of maritime space and resources. The eastward shift of colonisation, migration and investment was mirrored by, for instance, the whaling industry's shift from an Atlantic to a Pacific focus. And this was accompanied by a transformation of the industry's labour force. While African American and Caribbean whalers remain part of the British Empire's transnational maritime labour force, even as its centre shifted eastwards, the whaling industry from the 1830s increasingly relied on Aboriginal, Māori, South Asian and Pacific Islander workers. The colonisation of the Aucklands is a tiny part of this shift, but it serves as a reminder, as a focus point for the importance of the sea to imperial restructuring and reorientation, and suggests, I think, that there is some useful research to be done on bringing maritime industries and maritime spaces into conversations with this kind of scholarship. And I'll finish up there, I think, and hand over to Jeremy, I guess.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, both Rowan and Angela. Wonderful presentations. Thanks for keeping to time. I know that we had a little bit of a glitch, but that didn't take too much time. So although we've got, say, 15 minutes or so, I'm sure if we go a couple of minutes over past the half hour, it won't be the end of the world. Look, there are a number of questions. I will go through them in order as best I can. Just to keep things consistent, please put your questions in the webinar chat and I will read them out. So the first question I have is from Jane, and it's a question for Rowan. Rowan, did Wakefield and Enderby and other promoters have direct contact?
It's a good question, and it gives me a chance to make my disclaimer about my sources, which is that pretty much all of the relevant Enderby papers burned down in the 19th century. And so reconstructing this story is a bit more difficult than it looks, I think. There's a lot of papers in some seriously out of the way sort of archives. And so I can't really conclusively answer it. My sense is no. I haven't come across anything that suggests there is a personal connection. Definitely no correspondence that I've seen. If anyone has come across Enderby's name or something, please do let me know. But I haven't come across anything that suggests it was, and his involvement in the New Zealand company and the Western Australian company was very minor. So I think he was a removed enthusiast, and because he's obviously doing this in the 1840s, he's almost a critical commentator in many ways, and he has a very high opinion of himself and thinks I can upgrade systematic colonisation and do it my way, rather than there being any evidence of direct contact, I think.
All right, thanks very much, Rowan. The next question is from Zoe, and it's also to Rowan. This is fascinating. I wondered what level of interest there was in Enderby's economic and labour plans in the larger Antipodean colonies, and also from the imperial government. A minute from the third Earl Grey as colonial secretary in London to James Stephen in 1846 revealed his ignorance with respect to our right over the Auckland Islands. I see they are coloured red in Arrowsmith's map of the world, which I suppose implies some sort of claim on our part.
Yeah, it's an impressive quote to dig up on the fly, but I think it's a very indicative one. Like it does sum up the attitude in that they weren't particularly interested in the Auckland Islands. They were claimed by whaling companies working for Enderby, and Enderby had some very idiosyncratic ideas about the way that this kind of bestowed a right to them. He spent sort of 3 years complaining to the government, that basically complaining about the New Zealand company and saying that if these islands had been inhabited, we would have purchased the land and you would have recognised our title. But because they're uninhabited, we have to go through you and ask for a right to them, which all goes to show that there wasn't a ton of interest in them. It was purely Enderby's kind of enthusiasm for this as a place. He had lots of reasons for it. It wasn't just that his family had been involved in discovering them. A lot of it was to do with climate and the sealing of whale oil barrels. It's very niche. But it was very much driven by him rather than by the government. And when it was abandoned, there was a bit of discussion around, well, should we do anything with them? They kind of just let it sit for a decade, and then they extend the boundaries of New Zealand south to include them. And that lays the foundation for their incorporation into New Zealand later on.
Thank you. John Kinder, fascinating story of a seriously out of the way place or islands. When Enderby turned a blind eye to slavery on the Aucklands, who were the slaves, Maori or Moriori? Or sorry, if I don't, Moriori. And who were these slave owners, English or Maori?
Yeah, so it's Moriori are enslaved, and it was by Ngāti Mūsuna and Ngāti Tama. There's kind of some scholarship on that in the Chathams, less so on the Aucklands. There is a book, but it's a bit of a controversial book, so I won't drop the reference here. But there is some good scholarship. Andre Brett has an article on the Moriori genocide that talks a bit about this. You should be able to find as well.
We've got a question for Angela from Zoe. You and Jane make a strong case for Wakefield being influenced by slavery and abolition, but I wondered from your paper whether you've come across evidence that in the 1830s and 1840s, advocates of imperial indentured labour schemes were also influenced by Wakefield.
That's a good question, and I don't know the answer. I mean, clearly, these decades are the time of huge escalation of indentured labour schemes globally and including in Australia. It's possible that they were, but I think indentured labour had, of course, been around before. And indentured labour, I think in this period in Australia tended to be small groups of labourers brought by individuals or under the control of individuals or small numbers of people, and probably just on an older model of indentured labour, but it's certainly possible that they were influenced by Wakefield. And one of the questions that's been running through my mind, actually listening to some other papers, has been just who else was in conversation with Wakefield or influenced by Wakefield. So I think it continues to be an interesting question. When I was listening to Jane's paper, I kept thinking about whether Wakefield and Caroline Chisholm were ever in dialogue. So lots of questions there, I think. But thank you for the question.
I think Zoe's just added something as well, Angela. I was thinking of the big schemes to Mauritius and the Caribbean. So a replacement for emancipated slaves.
Aha, okay. That's a really good question too. And clearly we know that there were those big schemes in some places, but whether they were influenced by Wakefield, again, I'm sorry, I just don't know the answer, but I do think it's a very interesting question. Thank you.
And I see Jane Carey has made the point, following on from this, Australian convicts were also, of course, under indents. So I'd like to jump in actually, Angela, and ask you a question. So I've been doing work myself on hostility to John Hutt and his proximity to Wakefieldian ideas. And of course, what's happening down in Australand is very much an experiment, as you say, in Wakefieldian theorizing. How are the rest of the non-Australand settlers and colonists interacting with Australand, and what are they saying about the experiment, given that they see it as a threat, or they see systematic colonization as a threat to their interests further north around Swan River and the Avon Valley, etc.?
That's a good question. Again, I don't know the exact answer. I think partly because Australand pretty quickly fizzled, and the numbers shrank, and it did not totally die, as I pointed out. It did bounce back and continue on a very small scale, but it was quick to shrink, and a lot of the British labouring class people that had been brought over and who it had been hoped would actually stay around and do work left, decamped and went elsewhere. So I think fairly quickly it wasn't in any kind of threat to other settlements nearby. And of course, it had to fit into its region, and it developed, people at Australian developed relationships with, there was some interaction with the Princep estate, of course, which was nearby, and also with the resident magistrates a bit further south and so forth. So it, in many ways, Australian just became part of the region, but I think it was pretty quickly not much of a threat to anybody because of so many of the original labouring class people decamping and going off looking for better opportunities. Thank you for the question.
No, thank you. Thanks for that answer. Let's see. Don't see any other questions. Does anyone else want to post their question in the chat? Please go ahead.
Could I ask a question of Rowan?
Of course, of course.
Rowan, I'm just curious about, because we've talked earlier today about the directors and businessmen involved in companies. Your story of Enderby makes him sound like such a lone operator, whereas, Australand and some of the other Wakefieldian settlements had, teams of planners and schemers and backers in London that they had to answer to. Did Enderby have others he had to answer to?
It's a good point. Yeah. So he's definitely not as lone a wolf as I think. I mean, I think that's probably me writing backwards from the perspective of how everything falls out between him and his previous backers. So by the end of it, he's very much a lone wolf, doesn't get along with anybody, comes back to London and spends the rest of his days attempting to take credit for discovering Antarctica and writing to the British government saying, hey, the Auckland Islands are great, you should put a penal colony there, that's where you can send convicts, and why don't you make me Lieutenant Governor again? But early on, it's a very different story, and he is very much kind of, his brothers are very heavily involved as well, so there is that kind of element of family networks that I know you've written about and others have written about, as well as a lot of other networks with the other whaling companies. So by this point, the British-centred London whaling industry had been in decline for about 20 years. So the remaining companies and the remaining investors in whaling were all kind of connected. And some of them thought this was a terrible plan and wanted nothing to do with it, but a fairly large proportion of the kind of remaining whaling investors did get involved. And then there were various people that he knew through kind of other business connections. So people who were involved in insurance for whaling who ended up investing in the company. And then a kind of some more kind of high level sympathizers. James Clark Ross, who had actually been to the Auckland Islands, was one of his big backers. I don't think he ever actually put any money into the company, but he was involved in promoting it. And his endorsements meant a lot in terms of lending it legitimacy. Philip York, the Earl of Hardwicke, ended up involved as the governor of the court of directors, who again added quite a lot of legitimacy. And He published these statements in the London papers about how he wasn't going on active duty to the Mediterranean. He would be going to the colony himself because this sounds like the ideal settler colony. So there is definitely a much larger group involved, a few members of parliament, but they very quickly fall out within a couple of years.
Thank you.
All right. Well, no one else has posted a question. So, and we are coming very close to 5:30. So it's ended up working perfectly, everyone. So thank you again, Rowan and Angela. Of course, all of you who are listening, this is only the first day of our 2-day workshop. So we're looking forward, of course, to starting again tomorrow, Wednesday, the 30th of November. 2 p.m. In Perth time, 5 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time, 7 p.m. New Zealand time, and 6 in the morning, very early for those of you who are in the UK, and elsewhere, that's GMT actually, I should say. So look forward to seeing you there. Please, if you haven't already done so, register for tomorrow's session. I believe there are 2 separate tickets. And yes, thanks. Looking forward to catching up with all of you tomorrow, same time, well, same place anyway, wherever you are. So thanks very much again. Bye-bye.